London locked in endless frost and frozen pipes, muffled footsteps and fog that bit back. The year could be any in the Victorian century, really, because winter didn't politely end when spring showed up on the calendar. No, it lingered. It sulked. It clung to chimneys and froze the Thames into a makeshift playground of misery. Streets became skating rinks, laundry froze mid-flap and milk arrived solid. The air had that sharp metallic bite that made your teeth ache and your soul question every life choice. The good news, you were alive. The bad news, so were the fleas, hibernating in your blankets, plotting their next move. Hello travellers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep before we continue. Leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. This was not a picturesque Dickensian winter with cheerful carolers and gently falling snow. This was the kind of cold that humbled architecture. Houses groaned, the walls wept condensation, and somewhere a landlord still insisted the draught adds character. Victorian homes were not built for comfort, they were built to look moral. The thick stone fronts, tall ceilings and sprawling rooms may have screamed elegance, but they whispered hypothermia. And the higher your social status, the colder your home probably was, because God forbid comfort looked like laziness. Inside, survival became an art form. People gathered around fireplaces as if worshipping small hissing gods. Children hovered so close to the flames that their boots steamed. Parents argued over who forgot to shut the parlor door. Every draught was an invisible enemy, a phantom hand reaching under skirts and into bones. Curtains were drawn not for privacy, but to trap every molecule of heat. The Victorian house in winter was a fortress under siege, and the enemy was the air itself. Outside, the city slowed to a crawl. Horses slipped on icy cobblestones, their breath turning to foggy halos. Street vendors bundled themselves like cabbages, selling roasted chestnuts to numb-handed pedestrians. Newspapers froze on doorsteps, and letters arrived stiff as cardboard. The famous London fog, that mysterious romantic haze, was actually a noxious stew of coal smoke, mist and despair. It clung to clothing, to lungs, to the very idea of cleanliness. If you could smell it, you were too close. And yet, amid this frozen chaos, life went on. Work didn't stop because your water turned to ice sculptures. The factory still demanded your attendance, even if your eyelashes froze on the way there. The poor huddled under bridges, wrapping themselves in rags and old newspapers, the Victorian version of multi-layer insulation. The wealthy complained about unseasonable chill, while sipping brandy beside massive windows that leaked heat like open wounds. Everyone suffered. Some just did it with better furniture. For those in rural England, the situation wasn't much better. Cottages were picturesque only in paintings. In reality, they leaked wind from every direction and hosted frost so thick it formed patterns on the inside walls. You'd wake to see your own breath swirling above your pillow, a private weather system. Farmers had to break ice to reach their livestock's water, and many learned the hard way that frozen manure is surprisingly difficult to shovel. The cold reshaped behaviour. People spoke less because talking meant releasing warm air. Baths were postponed until spring, not for modesty, but because the water might freeze before you finished screaming. You learned to move quickly between rooms, like prey darting from one patch of safety to another. And at night, beds became battlegrounds against the chill. Blankets were layered in geological strata, flannel or wool quilts, sometimes even a carpet if you were desperate. Couples slept close, not out of affection, but because body heat was cheaper than coal. Doctors, ever the optimists, suggested that the cold toughened the constitution. They said this while wrapped in scarves, sipping something strong and avoiding house calls. For the working class, toughness was simply survival rebranded. For the upper class, winter was an aesthetic and snowy gardens viewed from inside drawing rooms, preferably while composing melancholic poetry about frost. But the real cruelty of the Victorian winter was psychological. There was no central heating to offer steady warmth. no electric light to banish gloom. The fire's glow was the only defiance against endless grey. When it died, the darkness felt heavier. Families clung to that little circle of light, listening to the crackle as if it could speak back. Outside, London's gas lamps flickered through fog, casting ghostly halos, tiny reminders that warmth was fragile, fleeting, and always conditional. So when you picture the Victorian winter, don't imagine snowflakes on lace and rosy cheeks by the fire. Imagine the city half frozen, citizens wrapped like mummies, and the constant nagging thought that one missed coal delivery could turn comfort into catastrophe. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, so are the drafts, and they're winning. The hearth ruled Victorian homes as the symbol of comfort, class and survival. Forget your modern radiator, your thermostat, or your smug smart home that learns your preferences. In the Victorian household, the fireplace was the algorithm. It decided who sat where, who froze, and who got to feel their toes. It wasn't just a hearth, it was Victorian Wi-Fi. Everyone gathered around it to connect. A good fire meant civilization. Without it, life was reduced to the chaos of damp socks and existential despair. Every room in a respectable house centered around the fireplace. Not because it was practical, it wasn't, but because it radiated symbolism as much as heat. The parlor fire was a statement. We are not animals. We have coal. Guests were seated near it like honorary members of the warmth elite. Children sprawled before it, dogs dozed beside it, and somewhere behind it all, a servant silently cursed while poking it back to life for the 10th time that morning. The ritual of fire-making was sacred. It began with ashes from the previous night, a hopeful continuity, a whisper that yesterday's warmth might spark again. Then came the kindling, tiny twigs, crumpled newspapers, or splinters of hope. Coal was added last, black and glistening like the promise of luxury itself. The sound of the first crackle was pure victory, a small rebellion against the eternal damp of Britain. When flames finally caught, families stared in reverent silence, as if witnessing a divine miracle. But this miracle came at a cost. Fire was fickle, the drama queen of household elements. Too much coal and it smoked like an angry dragon. Too little and it sulked into ashes. Maintaining the perfect burn was an art form, a domestic performance requiring constant attention. Victorians even developed a whole vocabulary for it. Damping down, raking through, stoking up. To tend a fire properly was to prove one's virtue. A man who could manage his hearth was a man in control of his household, though, let's be honest, it was usually the maid doing all the real work. For women, the hearth became both sanctuary and stage. The lady of the house was expected to preside gracefully beside it, sipping tea as if the flames bowed to her will. But for working-class wives, it was a battlefield. The fire had to cook meals, heat water, dry clothes, and occasionally thaw limbs. Keeping it alive through long hours meant a constant cycle of feeding, scraping, and cleaning. Soot crept into hair, lungs, and laundry, and the black tax of survival. Yet for all its dirt and danger, the hearth remained the emotional heart of the home. It glowed when the family gathered. It hissed when damp weather teased the flu. It told stories in sparks. Children saw magic in it. The play of light and shadow, the hypnotic dance of flames, this was their television. Tales were told here, songs were sung, the amusements flared and cooled in rhythm with the fire. The glow turned faces soft and voices low. Even in houses divided by class or temper, the fire united them for at least one honest moment each evening. You didn't stare into the flames because you were cold, you did it because the flicker looked like memory itself. Architecturally, fireplaces were status markers. The wealthy commissioned mantels carved from marble, adorned with Greek columns or cherubic faces that smiled down on your heating bill. The middle class favoured cast iron inserts, ornate, glossy, and guaranteed to rust if you so much as looked at them wrong. The poor made do with rough brick openings, patched with whatever they could afford. But no matter the style, Every hearth came with its entourage of tools, pokers, shovels, tongs, bellows, and a brush that somehow always went missing when you needed it most. Victorians also believed the hearth had a moral dimension. A clean, well-tended fire signified discipline and respectability. A neglected one hinted at laziness or worse, moral decay. Magazines of the day lectured endlessly about the cheerful fire being essential to family virtue, as if a warm coal bed could fix a cold marriage. Yet people believed it. A dimming flame was bad luck, an empty grate, a social embarrassment. The hearth was as much about image as it was about heat, glowing proof that the household had its life together, or at least could fake it for visitors. And then there was the danger. Chimney fires were terrifyingly common, sending sparks leaping onto carpets and curtains. Women's long skirts were practically invitations to combustion. There are grim newspaper clippings describing how her attire caught most unfortunately. A single moment of distraction could turn domestic bliss into tragedy. Yet people still gathered around the flames, trusting them as both friend and foe. Every evening, as the streets outside froze and gas lamps flickered through fog, the hearth stood its ground. The smell of burning coal mixed with tea steam and candle wax. Conversation hummed. The day's exhaustion melted into that glowing rectangle of light. You might not have been rich, you might not have been warm, but if your fire burned steady, you belonged to civilization. When the flames finally dimmed and the coals sank to a dull red, someone would rake the embers and whisper the quiet promise every Victorian made before bed. Let it catch again tomorrow. Because without that fire, the house wasn't a home, it was just a shell in the fog, and nobody wanted to wake up to that kind of cold. Coal powered everything from homes to empires, the black gold of Britain. Forget diamonds, forget silk, forget tea. If you lived in the Victorian age, nothing made your world spin quite like a sack of coal. It was the smell of prosperity, the sound of industry, and the taste of survival, quite literally, since every meal, every bath, every bit of warmth depended on it. Victorians didn't measure wealth in gold, they measured it in how many lumps of coal you could hoard before January. Coal wasn't just fuel, it was identity. Britain's rise as the world's industrial superpower rested on the backs of blackened miners and the mountains of carbon they pulled from the earth. It powered the factories that clothed the world, the locomotives that carried it, and the fireplaces that pretended to make it all look cosy. If there was a smell to the 19th century, it was coal smoke, thick, oily, and impossible to escape. London's skyline didn't glow with sunrise, it coughed to life. In the average household, coal dictated everything, from budgets to mood. For the working class, buying coal was a weekly act of anxiety. Merchants sold it by the sack, weighed on creaky scales, often watered down to cheat the customer. Housewives inspected each delivery like detectives. Was it dusty and poor quality slack, or the good dense lumps that burned hot and slow? A ton of coal could cost more than a month's rent, so every piece mattered. People counted coal the way modern families count paychecks. You didn't waste it, you worshipped it. Those who couldn't afford proper coal got creative. They scavenged from railway yards, picked up scraps from coal wagons, or bought cheaper breeze, fine coal dust pressed into sad little balls. Children, faces blackened with soot, would line the docks or railway tracks, hoping to grab fallen pieces from carts. There was even a slang term for it. Nobbing. Imagine risking your life for a handful of dirt that might keep your fingers from freezing. In Victorian Britain, that wasn't a metaphor, it was Tuesday. Meanwhile, the wealthy treated coal like fine wine. They ordered the best Welsh anthracite, prized for its clean burn and minimal smoke, and stored it in ornate scuttles beside gleaming marble fireplaces. Coal became a mark of taste. Having the right kind meant your drawing room smelled civilized, not like a factory floor. Even the ashes mattered. They had to be sifted, cooled and removed discreetly, lest visiting guests catch a glimpse of the house's dirty reality. In a society obsessed with appearances, Coal was both invisible and omnipresent, the polite stain that kept everything running. The logistics of coal were staggering. It arrived in London by the boatload, hauled from northern mines by canal and rail. The River Thames became a conveyor belt of coal barges. Dockworkers heaved sacks day and night, covering the city in a fine grey dust that settled on everything: curtains, crumpets, lungs. The capital's air was less fresh and more chewable. Yet to Victorians, that smell was comforting. It was the scent of progress, proof that Britain was burning its way into modernity. Mining itself was a world apart, dark, dangerous and relentless. Men, women, and even children descended into the earth before dawn, armed with pickaxes and hope. They worked in narrow tunnels lit by flickering oil lamps, their bodies caked in soot and sweat. Accidents were frequent. Explosions, collapses, and suffocation were grimly routine. But the demand for coal was insatiable. Cities needed light, trains needed power, homes needed heat. The empire needed everything, and coal was the answer, no matter the cost. It's hard to overstate just how much coal defined daily life. It powered the cooking range that boiled your tea, the stove that warmed your iron, the steam engine that delivered your letters, and the gasworks that lit your street lamps. Even the factories that made your lace gloves and porcelain figurines puffed black clouds skyward, declaring Britain's global dominance and lung problems. The entire social order was quite literally built on ash. The irony: the same coal that kept Victorians alive was slowly killing them. The smoke filled homes, streets and lungs. It blackened walls, eroded stonework, and dimmed daylight into perpetual twilight. By the mid-century, cities like Manchester and Sheffield were so polluted that trees died, and white laundry came off the line looking like mourning cloth. Yet no one dared complain too loudly. Coal was too powerful, too essential, too profitable. You could hate it, but you couldn't live without it, like the empire's toxic best friend. And still, coal had its rituals. The deliveryman's knock was a sound of reassurance. The sight of a freshly filled coal bunker meant security. It was the one commodity that didn't lie. When the fire burned bright, you were safe. When it sputtered out, you were one shivering mistake away from misery. People even anthropomorphized it. They spoke of coal behaving badly, refusing to catch or sulking in the grate. In a world where everything was uncertain, wages, weather, health, coal was the one dependable drama. By the end of the century, some reformers began to question whether blanketing the nation in soot was in fact a good idea. Scientists studied smoke abatement, inventors tinkered with cleaner stoves, and newspapers printed polite panic about the fog menace. But old habits die hard. For the Victorians, coal wasn't merely energy, it was emotion. It warmed their homes, powered their ambitions, and filled their skies. It was comfort and consequence in equal measure. So when you think of the Victorian era, don't imagine just lace curtains and carriages. Picture a world built on burning rock, a nation that glowed not from enlightenment, but from endless combustion. Coal was the heartbeat of empire, pulsing in every engine, every hearth, every breath. It was progress wrapped in soot, and it to never stop burning. Essential yet dangerous, chimneys clogged, smoked, and burned with equal enthusiasm. If the Victorian fireplace was the heart of the home, then the chimney was its temperamental throat, constantly coughing, occasionally choking, and once in a while belching smoke like a dragon with indigestion. Victorians loved their fires, but those cosy hearths came with a vertical nightmare, a long, dark tunnel of soot and soot-based regret. If your chimney wasn't smoking, it was probably on fire. A proper chimney was a marvel of 19th century engineering and 18th century denial. London alone had thousands of miles of flues twisting and turning above the rooftops, narrow brick arteries designed to funnel smoke out and keep the social order intact. The upper classes built grand, elaborate chimneys with multiple flues to serve each of their countless fireplaces. The poor, crammed into cramped terraces, had one modest chimney that worked about as well as a straw in a milkshake. The difference between warmth and suffocation often came down to how well your chimney behaved that week. Chimneys were moody creatures. One day they drew beautifully, flames crackling, smoke rising politely. The next, they sulked and sent clouds of soot pouring back into the parlour. Families would wave their arms and curse as the room filled with acrid fog. Curtains yellowed, lungs wheezed, and dinner tasted faintly of coal tar. This wasn't rare. It was Tuesday. The Victorians had an entire domestic vocabulary for it. The chimney's on the blow, it's drawing foul, or the flue's sulking again. The fireplace was supposed to comfort you, but it also kept you humble. The culprit, more often than not, was soot. Every fire left behind a layer of sticky black residue that clung to the chimney walls like guilt to a politician. Over time, that soot built up, narrowing the flue until smoke had nowhere to go but sideways, into your drapes, your dinner, and your lungs. And if that weren't enough, soot was flammable. A single spark could turn your polite parlour glow into a roaring chimney inferno. The sound of it was unforgettable. A deep, whooshing roar, followed by sparks shooting from the rooftop like fireworks announcing your bad luck. Chimney fires terrified Victorians. Whole streets of tightly packed houses could go up in flames because someone fell asleep without damping down the grate. Newspapers ran grim stories. A terrible conflagration in Bloomsbury, the cause neglected flues. Insurance companies started requiring proof of regular cleaning, the 19th century version of clear your browser history. It wasn't just cleanliness, it was survival, and thus entered the most tragic profession in Victorian domestic life, the chimney sweep. Usually a small boy, often an orphan or a workhouse child, he was sent up those narrow flues armed with brushes, scrapers, and the kind of optimism only children possess before they know what's in store. The average chimney narrowed to just 9 inches across. Most grown men couldn't fit, which made children ideal. The soot fell on them, in them, and around them. Coughing was part of the job description. Many developed soot warts, a euphemism for chimney sweep cancer, one of the first industrial diseases ever documented. To clean a chimney, a sweep would strip down, tie a rope around his waist, and climb barefoot into the shaft, scraping soot with brushes or metal rods as he went. The lucky ones came back down. The unlucky got stuck, suffocated, or burned when the fire below was lit too soon. And yet, for all the horror, Victorian households depended on them. A dirty chimney was a ticking time bomb, and so paradoxically society justified the practice. It took decades of campaigning led by reformers and outraged clergy before mechanical brushes and adult sweeps replaced the children entirely. Even after climbing boys were mostly banned, chimney maintenance remained a messy, necessary ritual. Households scheduled regular cleanings, though few looked forward to it. The sweep's arrival meant a morning of chaos, soot raining down, furniture draped in sheets, and the air filled with curses and black dust. Servants scurried to open windows, though that usually just invited more fog in. When it was over, everyone pretended to admire the fresh draught, though in truth the house smelled like burnt toast and misery. Beyond hygiene, chimneys were architectural fashion statements. The Victorians couldn't resist embellishing even their exhaust systems. Mansions sported elaborate brick stacks, some with multiple flues twisting together like red clay braids. Chimney pots, those tall decorative extensions at the top, became status symbols. The taller and fancier your pots, the prouder your builder. They came in terracotta, stoneware, even cast iron, and occasionally resembled miniature Gothic towers. Nothing said refined taste like spending extra money to make your smoke look elegant. But for all their grandeur, chimneys were the great equalizer. No matter your class, your chimney could betray you. Too much smoke signalled inefficiency or poor design. A smoky parlour embarrassed the lady of the house. It suggested domestic disorder. The middle classes, ever anxious to appear respectable, turned chimney management into a moral duty. Manuals advised on the proper tending of drafts, and the gentlemanly avoidance of soot. You could fail socially just by having a flue that misbehaved. Then came the smells. Chimneys vented not only smoke, but the sense of every activity below: burnt stew, damp coal, failed experiments in cooking. In close-packed neighbourhoods, chimneys formed a gossip network of smells. Your neighbour's roast mingled with your own dinner, creating an airborne buffet of other people's lives. On foggy nights, when the wind turned wrong, whole streets smelled like one enormous overcooked meal. Despite all this chaos, the chimney remained indispensable. Without it, the Victorian home would suffocate. It was the unsung infrastructure of survival, dirty, dangerous, but irreplaceable. People lived and died by their chimneys. They cursed them, cleaned them, and occasionally climbed them to patch a crack or rescue a stuck jackdaw. No one truly loved their chimney, but no one dared live without it. By the turn of the century, new heating methods, gas fires, hot water radiators, even primitive central systems, began to steal the spotlight. Yet even then, chimneys stood proudly on rooftops, silhouettes against the smoky London sky. They were scars of an era that burned too fiercely and cleaned too little. And if you saw a column of smoke curling lazily into the grey air, you could be certain of one thing: somewhere below, a Victorian family was alive, arguing about drafts and hoping the chimney behaved tonight. Child labour met soot and suffocation in the grim trade of chimney sweeping, one of the dirtiest, deadliest, and most disturbingly normal professions of the Victorian age. In a society obsessed with cleanliness, it's darkly poetic that thousands of children spent their days scraping black filth out of other people's homes. Nothing says childhood like climbing up a flue full of carcinogens before breakfast. Victorians liked to romanticise the sweep, a cheeky little urchin with a smudge on his nose whistling as he worked. The reality was far less musical. Most chimney sweeps began their careers before they could spell the word chimney. They were small, nimble, and expendable, three qualities Victorian employers loved in a worker. Many came from workhouses, orphanages, or were simply sold by desperate parents. The so-called master sweep would buy or apprentice them, promising food and shelter. What they actually got was a burlap sack, a brush, and a lifetime supply of soot in their lungs. A typical workday began before dawn. The child, often no older than 6 or 7, was woken, beaten awake if necessary, and sent into the first flue of the morning. Naked or nearly so, clothes caught on the brickwork, he would crawl up a shaft no wider than his shoulders, dragging a brush or scraper above him. The air was suffocating. The soot burned eyes, choked throats, and clung to every inch of skin. In the dark, hot, airless vertical tunnels, many panicked. Some froze halfway up, paralysed with fear. The master's solution: light a small fire beneath them to encourage progress. Nothing motivates like third-degree burns. For those who survived, every climb came with a new collection of injuries: scraped elbows, raw knees, and lungs that wheezed like harmonicas. The soot embedded itself so deeply in their skin that no amount of washing could remove it. Their hair turned coarse, their teeth blackened, and their voices developed a permanent rasp. The cough of a sweep was so distinct it might as well have been a job title. Doctors even coined a disease for them: chimney sweep's carcinoma, one of the first occupational cancers ever identified. It began as painful sores in the groin from constant soot exposure, and it spread with tragic speed. Children were literally consumed by the very substance they cleaned. And yet, despite the horror, chimney sweeps were everywhere, scrambling over rooftops, scuttling through flues, black silhouettes against grey skies. Passers-by barely noticed. Sooty children were as much a part of the urban landscape as gas lamps or horses. The industry was small-scale but essential. Every home with a fireplace needed clean flues, or the next spark could turn into an inferno. Families hired sweeps regularly, not out of cruelty but necessity. No one thought too deeply about who was doing the work or what it cost them. Not all sweeps were boys either. In some poorer regions, small girls were used as well, particularly in Scotland and Ireland. They were valued for their slight frames and obedient nature, a phrase that could curdle your tea. Whether boy or girl, the job was the same. Crawl, scrape, choke, repeat. Payment came in pennies, if at all. The masters pocketed most of the profit, feeding their apprentices on scraps and keeping them locked in cellars at night to prevent escape. Some of these cellars had nicknames like the Black Hole, and for good reason. It wasn't until the reformers started raising hell and newspapers finally printed the grisly details that people began to realise just how horrific the practice was. One name stands out, Lord Shaftesbury, a philanthropist who made it his mission to end the use of child sweeps. He pushed for laws banning the practice, starting with the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1840. But like most Victorian laws, it was about as effective as a paper umbrella in a thunderstorm. Enforcement was lax, and master sweeps simply ignored it. The children kept climbing. It took nearly 40 years, and several more rounds of legislation, before mechanical brushes and adult sweeps finally replaced child labour. The decisive change came with the 1875 Chimney Sweepers Act, which actually had teeth and inspectors. Even then, some masters found loopholes or bribed officials. The fight to end child sweeps wasn't quick or clean. It was slow, grim, and covered in soot. By the late Victorian era, the image of the chimney sweep began to shift from grim necessity to sentimental relic. Literature sanitised them. Cheerful boys who sang Chim Chim Cher-ee decades before Disney did. Artists painted them as symbols of humble virtue. It was as if the nation collectively decided to forget that these merry sweeps were once the most exploited children in Europe. Memory, it turns out, burns cleaner than coal. Still, traces of their real lives remain in the records. Testimonies of children who spoke of fear, darkness, and the constant taste of ash. One orphan wrote, "The soot was in my hair, my eyes, my teeth, my belly. I think it went into my dreams." That's not metaphor, that's the price of Victorian warmth. Ironically, chimney sweeps became lucky charms in later folklore, symbols of good fortune, especially at weddings. People would pay to have a sweep shake their hand or appear in photographs, believing their soot-streaked presence brought blessings. Somewhere the ghosts of those little boys must have laughed at the absurdity. After all, they'd spent their childhoods climbing for other people's comfort. Now, at least they got applause. So next time you picture the cosy glow of a Victorian fire, imagine the path that heat took, up through a flue polished by tiny trembling hands. The chimneys gleamed because children had scraped their way through them. The warmth that filled drawing rooms was paid for in the childhoods, lost to soot. And that, more than anything, was the true cost of keeping winter at bay in the age of progress. Coal meant life, but it cost dearly. Poverty turned every ember into currency. In the Victorian winter, warmth wasn't a comfort. It was an economy. Every flake of soot had a price tag. Every glowing ember was an investment. The fire might have flickered prettily in middle-class parlours, but in the homes of the poor it was survival rationed by the shilling. The poor burned anything they could find. The rich just burned money more efficiently. Coal was the empire's lifeblood, but it didn't flow evenly. A ton of the stuff could keep a respectable townhouse cosy for weeks, if you could afford it. For everyone else, coal was measured by the bucket, sold in dusty handfuls from carts that trundled through city streets. The coalman's call, a guttural coal, coal echoing through alleys, was both salvation and humiliation. You bought what you could, when you could, and prayed the pile would last until the next payday. Families became mathematicians of misery, counting out lumps like coins, deciding whether the kitchen or the children's bedroom would get heat today. In the poorest districts, the coal bucket was often empty. The alternative? Burn whatever wasn't nailed down. Old furniture, rotting floorboards, even shoes. Anything that could smoulder was fair game. Victorian police records are full of accidental fires caused by desperate attempts to burn makeshift fuel. One report from Manchester noted that a woman burned her front door because it was the only wood left that wasn't damp. Another from Leeds described a family burning horse dung and calling it country fuel. If warmth had a smell, it was desperation lightly seasoned with regret. Meanwhile, the middle classes were obsessed with fuel efficiency. Magazines ran articles titled "How to Economize the Fire" and "Prudent Management of Coal." Homemakers were lectured about keeping the grate in good order, as if virtue itself could raise the room temperature. "A tidy fire," one manual advised, "is the mark of a moral woman." It was always a woman, of course, because men were apparently too busy being cold somewhere else. The Victorian obsession with thrift meant that even the glow of a fire came with guilt. Was that extra shovelful of coal worth it, or was it sin in ember form? The wealthy, of course, experienced warmth differently. In their mansions, coal arrived by the cartload. High-grade Welsh anthracite for the drawing room, cheaper local coal for the servants' quarters. Fires burned in half a dozen rooms at once, tended by maids who risked blisters to ensure that not a single guest saw a flickering flame die. But even the rich weren't immune to the economics of heat. Fuel bills were staggering, and the sheer logistics of keeping dozens of chimneys clear was enough to make accountants weep. Still, a glowing fire was a status symbol. Proof that one could afford to waste what others starved for. It was luxury disguised as necessity. For the working class, fuel poverty was as real as hunger. In slums and tenements, winter became a test of endurance. Smoke from cheap coal filled rooms until you couldn't tell if your eyes were watering from heat or from chemical assault. The poorest families often shared fires between households, huddling together in one small room like penguins in a storm. Children were sent to bed early, not because they were tired, but because blankets were cheaper than coal. Mothers builded kettles not just for tea, but to let the steam warm their faces for a moment. And still, frost crept down the walls. Charities tried to intervene. Coal clubs were founded in many towns, cooperative societies where workers contributed a few pennies each week to buy coal in bulk at winter's end. Churches held coal distributions, giving sacks of fuel to the most destitute. Newspapers printed stories of miraculous generosity. A kindly gentleman donating 5 tons to the parish poor, a lady of some means paying for a widow's fire. But for every act of charity, thousands went cold. It wasn't neglect, it was arithmetic. There simply wasn't enough warmth to go around. In the countryside, the problem took a different shape. Farmers burned peat, brushwood, or even dried turf cut from fields, cheaper, but smoky and short-lived. Country homes had vast fireplaces, large enough to roast an ox, yet many of them stood cold because filling them was ruinous. It was one of history's small ironies. The bigger your hearth, the harder it was to afford to use it. A poor cottage with a tiny grate often stayed warmer than a gentry hall, with ceilings high enough to host a blizzard. Fuel theft became its own winter industry. Children snatched lumps from coal carts when drivers weren't looking. Men scavenged near railway lines, picking up fragments that had fallen from transport wagons. In some mining towns, women and children crept onto slag heaps at night, sifting through waste coal with bare hands. The practice was so common it earned a name: coaling. It wasn't a crime in their eyes, it was survival. When caught, the courts disagreed. You could be jailed for stealing something that kept you alive. The cost of warmth wasn't just economic, it was emotional. The sound of coal rattling in the scuttle was the sound of security. The moment it ran out, the house changed. Conversations grew shorter. Tempers flared. Hope shrank to a flickering glow behind the grate. People dreamed not of wealth or comfort, but of steady heat. To be warm, wrote one East End labourer, is to feel rich for a moment. By the late 19th century, social reformers began to recognise that heating wasn't a luxury, it was dignity. Campaigners called for fair fuel prices, improved insulation, a laughable concept at the time, and public warming rooms. But the problem lingered like the smoke it produced. Even as the empire expanded and factories roared, millions at home shivered in the shadows of their chimneys, measuring each night by how long the last coal lasted. In the end, The cost of warmth in Victorian Britain wasn't just counted in coins, it was paid in illness, in exhaustion, in nights where frost formed on the inside of windows and families pressed close around dying fires. Coal might have powered an empire, but for most of its citizens, it was never quite enough to thaw the chill. Ornate fireplaces became social theatre. Warmth as performance, civility as choreography. The Victorian parlour was not simply a room, it was a declaration. Everything about it, the arrangement of furniture, the embroidered antimacassars, the wax piano no one actually played and screamed, "We are respectable, cultured and moderately uncomfortable." It was the stage where the middle class performed their idea of refinement. Victorian parlours were like Instagram feeds, all for show, rarely functional. The fireplace naturally was the centrepiece, but it wasn't just there to heat the room, it was there to announce the room. Visitors didn't need to ask about your social status, they just looked at your mantelpiece. The richer the ornamentation, the more respectable the family. Marble mantels, cast iron grates, gilt-framed mirrors. This was not heating, this was hierarchy. Even the choice of coal scuttle mattered. Polished brass suggested class, dented tin suggested hardship. The hearth became a mirror reflecting aspiration rather than flame. When guests arrived, the parlour fire was always freshly lit, often to the dismay of the servant who had to coax it into life with wet coal and prayer. The hostess would guide her visitors toward the hearth as if offering communion. Conversation unfolded in concentric circles around it. Gossip, courtship, business, all orbiting that flickering symbol of stability. If the flames burned too low, someone discreetly rang for the maid. A dying fire suggested domestic failure, and in Victorian society, failure was colder than the draught itself. Parlours had rules, an unspoken etiquette as rigid as the furniture. Men stood, women perched, children were ornamental. The host controlled the fire, much like they controlled the conversation. There was an art to tending it gracefully. The careful tap of the poker, the delicate rearrangement of coals. Too vigorous, and you risked looking common. Too hesitant, and you appeared weak. Manuals on manners actually offered advice on this. One guide warned that a gentleman should never stir a lady's fire without invitation. That might sound like flirting, but in 19th century terms, it was practically scandalous. Every item near the fireplace told a story. Over the mantel hung family portraits or moralising prints, the industrious apprentice or the angel of the hearth. On the mantel itself stood a clutter of objects, porcelain dogs staring into eternity, a clock that never kept time, and perhaps a vase of flowers that hadn't seen water since the Crimean War. These were not decorations, they were trophies of gentility. The Victorians believed that a crowded mantel suggested emotional depth. In reality, it suggested early onset hoarding. The firelight itself was a form of lighting design. Before electricity, gas lamps were too harsh for polite company. The flicker of a fire, however, was flattering. It softened faces, warmed complexions, and blurred imperfections. Many a Victorian romance began under its glow, where shadows could conceal awkwardness and the flames seemed to listen better than chaperones. The hearth was not just the heart of the home, it was the original dating app, matching couples through shared proximity to heat. But beyond flirtation and formality, the parlour fire had a deeper function. It symbolised moral warmth. A well-kept hearth suggested a well-kept soul. Women were judged by the cheerfulness of their fires as much as the cleanliness of their floors. A dark, cold parlour implied neglect, or worse, moral decay. The Household Words magazine once proclaimed, "The glow of the hearth is the glow of virtue." That's a lovely sentiment, unless you're the servant scraping soot out of it for the 5th time that day. For the middle class, the parlour was where ambition burned brightest, or it was the gateway between the private world of the family and the public eye of society. Invitations to tea, music evenings, or at-homes were all opportunities to display not only one's taste, but one's ability to maintain a fire without turning the room into a smokehouse. Guests would comment politely on how delightfully warm it feels here, to which the host would demur, "Oh, nothing at all, just a little coal." Lies, of course. The coal bill was probably higher than the furniture payments. Even the way people sat reflected their relationship with the flame. The elderly hovered close, faces flushed and stoic. The young lingered just far enough to avoid sweating through their corsets. Children were banished to the rug, ostensibly to enjoy the warmth, but mostly to keep them from touching the china. Dogs naturally claimed the best spot of all. The direct line of heat, stretching themselves into languid puddles of fur. Victorian pets understood class better than their owners. Then came the ritual of the evening fire. After supper, lamps were dimmed, chairs drawn close, and conversation softened. Letters were written, knitting resumed, novels read aloud. The room became a sanctuary, the world outside fading into fog and frost. The fire's crackle replaced the city's clatter. For a brief few hours, the illusion of comfort was complete. You could almost forget the coal smoke staining the ceiling, the draught sneaking through the floorboards, or the servant in the next room coughing up soot. And yet this performance of warmth mattered deeply. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was hope. The parlour was how Victorians reassured themselves that civilization could triumph over cold chaos and class. If your fire burned brightly, then surely all was right with the world, even if only within those 4 wallpapered walls. By the late century, the parlour began to lose its grip on the social imagination. New technologies, gas fires, radiators, electricity, began to encroach, and formality gave way to comfort. But in the collective memory, the parlour remained a symbol of the age itself, ornate, over-decorated, slightly absurd, yet fiercely proud of its warmth. The fire may have been a performance, but for those who lived by its light, it was the one show worth keeping on. Frozen sheets, bed warmers, and hot bricks under quilts made sleep a nightly conquest. Victorian bedrooms weren't the romantic candle-lit havens of costume dramas. They were more like sub-zero endurance tests with better drapery. The cold didn't politely wait outside. It moved in, unpacked its bags, and made itself comfortable. Every night was a duel between human ingenuity and the laws of thermodynamics. Nothing says romance like sharing a bed with a metal pan full of boiling water. When the temperature dropped, Victorian bedrooms transformed into scenes of heroic preparation. Before bed, the family's nightly ritual began, a domestic military operation involving kettles, blankets, and quiet desperation. Servants trudged upstairs with jugs of steaming water to fill porcelain basins for washing, which immediately turned tepid before anyone could use them. The air hung heavy with the smell of damp fabric and coal smoke drifting faintly from downstairs, the last warmth of the house giving up halfway to the second floor. Bedrooms, especially in large townhouses, were tombs of frost and echoing footsteps. The main weapon in the war against cold was the bed warmer, a metal pan attached to a long wooden handle, filled with hot coals or stones, and slid between the sheets like a heated torpedo. The idea was to warm the bed before climbing in. The reality, scalding one's legs, setting sheets on fire, or waking to the smell of singed linen and panic. There were horror stories of careless servants leaving the warmer too long, only to return to find smoking mattresses, or worse, the bed literally ablaze. The romantic glow of the Victorian bedroom was sometimes just open flame. Those of lesser means improvised. Country folk and city poor alike used hot bricks, wrapped in flannel or old stockings, tucked at the foot of the bed. A well-heated brick was worth its weight in gold, and occasionally about as heavy. There were also earthenware hot water bottles, known charmingly as foot pigs, shaped vaguely like flattened jugs. They worked wonderfully until they leaked, in which case you awoke both wet and miserable, unsure whether to blame the bottle or your bladder. And then came the bedding itself, layer upon layer, until the bed resembled a pastry. Victorians loved heavy quilts, woolen blankets, eiderdowns, and counterpanes. Climbing under them was less like lying down and more like being slowly buried in comfort. The first few minutes were pure horror, sheets so cold they could make your teeth ache. But once the body heat started working, the bed became a private furnace, at least until you needed to turn over, at which point you risked losing all accumulated warmth and possibly your will to live. sharing the bed was not optional for most. Heating an entire bedroom for one person was a luxury even many of the middle class couldn't afford. Families doubled up, children together, servants together, sometimes even boarders sharing space out of economic necessity. Privacy was a modern invention. Warmth required company. For newlyweds, this might sound cozy. In practice, it was two people fighting a silent war over blanket territory while breathing clouds into the darkness. Cuddling for heat was less romantic than survival instinct. The truly wealthy had a secret weapon, the four-poster bed. Draped in heavy curtains, it wasn't just for privacy, it was insulation. Draw the curtains and you created a small microclimate of breathable warmth, trapping every exhaled sigh inside your fabric fortress. The air might turn stale by morning, but at least you could feel your nose. These beds became architectural marvels, carved oak frames, velvet hangings, tassels that could double as weapons, and for many Victorians they symbolised success, the ability to sleep without freezing to death. Even so, the battle never ended. Ice crept over windows like lace embroidery, delicate and mocking. Water left on the bedside table froze solid overnight. Slippers, forgotten near the wall, became stiff as stone. In letters and diaries, Victorians complained constantly about the morning chill, that first agonising step out from under the covers. There was a moment of existential crisis each day, the choice between getting up or simply staying cocooned forever. Servants, of course, had no such choice. They rose before dawn to light fires in the main rooms, shivering in their unheated attic quarters. Some slept near kitchen ranges or in sculleries just to be close to the lingering warmth of the coals. Their bedding was minimal, their rooms draughty, and their complaints unheard. The mistress of the house might boast that her home was beautifully warm by breakfast, never pausing to imagine who had paid that warmth in frostbite. Doctors, in their infinite Victorian wisdom, had opinions about sleeping in cold rooms. Some believed it hardened the constitution and kept the blood brisk. Others warned that damp and chill could lead to pneumonia, rheumatism, or worse, the dreaded chill on the liver, a diagnosis both vague and terrifying. Remedies included flannel nightclothes, mustard plasters, and hot toddies for circulation. It's possible that the toddy was the only one that truly worked. Even fashion bent to the will of winter. Nightcaps, flannel drawers, wool stockings, and even full nightgowns resembling modest ghosts were standard. The sight of a Victorian couple preparing for bed resembled a two-person laundry day, layers upon layers, until passion was scientifically impossible. The goal wasn't allure, it was insulation. And yet, despite the discomfort, there was something almost poetic about the Victorian bedroom battle. Each night the world shrank to that small glowing core of human warmth beneath blankets. Outside, frost painted the windows. Inside, someone tucked a brick beneath their feet and whispered good night into the cold air. It was a fragile peace, a truce between flesh and frost, renewed every sunset. By morning, when the first grey light crept through frozen glass, the room was once again an icebox. The ritual began anew. Rekindle the fire downstairs, boil the kettle, chase warmth like it was prey. Victorian life was full of grandeur, invention, and empire, but at the end of the day, survival often depended on nothing more sophisticated than a brick, a blanket, and the sheer stubbornness not to freeze. The kitchen's fire drew family and servants alike, the only room where warmth and hunger met. Forget the parlour's polite flicker or the bedroom's pitiful brick in a sock trick. The kitchen was the beating, sweating, wheezing heart of the Victorian household. It was less come for the food and more come for the body heat. Unlike the drawing rooms and studies upstairs where fires existed for show and social performance, the kitchen fire was unapologetically real. It roared, hissed, and spat its authority. The great iron range, the Victorian super appliance, did everything from boiling soup to scorching eyebrows. It was both stove and space heater, water boiler and incinerator, symbol of progress and source of burns. It never truly went out, only dimmed into embers overnight, like an old soldier resting before another day of duty. Servants were its first disciples. The cook, usually a formidable woman armed with ladle and temper, commanded the range like an orchestra conductor. Scullery maids kept it fed with coal, wiped its soot-blackened flues, and prayed it didn't smoke them out before breakfast. The kitchen in winter was an infernal paradise, equal parts comfort and chaos. Pans clattered, kettles hissed, dough rose beside the heat, and steam hung in the air like an accidental fog. The floorboards radiated warmth so fierce that the family dog made a permanent camp nearby, a living rug that no one dared move. But the warmth wasn't just physical, it was social. For servants, the kitchen was their world, where gossip simmered, friendships baked, and complaints about the master were roasted to perfection. It was the one room where hierarchy softened, if only a little. Upstairs might have had chandeliers, but downstairs had life, messy, loud and warm. While the family dined in elegant silence above, servants below laughed through their exhaustion, trading stories over stew pots and borrowed spoons. The kitchen for them was both workplace and refuge. For the family, the kitchen's warmth was a guilty pleasure. Respectable Victorians pretended not to frequent it. Kitchens were below stairs, out of sight and smell. But even the most dignified souls found excuses to wander down on cold mornings. Just to check on the bread, they'd say, while conveniently standing beside the range until their bones thawed. Children were worse. They hovered like moths around the heat, sneaking bites of pastry dough and draping themselves over the dog. The kitchen fire didn't judge, it simply glowed, indifferent to class, etiquette, or muddy boots. Technologically, the Victorian kitchen was a marvel and a nightmare. The coal-fired range replaced the open hearth, promising cleaner, faster cooking. It delivered both progress and misery in equal measure. The new iron beasts required constant tending, intricate dampers and nerves of steel. Too much coal and dinner turned into charcoal. Too little, and the pudding sulked into sludge. Cookbooks of the day read like survival manuals. Beware the treacherous oven draft. Adjust the damper but slightly lest the roast revolt. A single misjudged ember could ruin a meal, a mood or a marriage. Still, the kitchen fire was dependable in a way that no other part of the house could match. While upstairs fireplaces sputtered and coughed their way through coal rations, the kitchen range burned with glorious constancy. It had to. The household's rhythm depended on it. It boiled the laundry water, heated the irons, dried wet boots, and warmed buckets for washing. Every task orbited its heat. Servants hung damp clothes from ceiling racks called creels, transforming the air into a humid stew of steam and starch. In winter, stepping into the kitchen from the icy hallway was like entering another climate, tropical, noisy, and smelling faintly of gravy. The smells were part of its identity. The kitchen carried the aroma of everything: baking bread, boiling cabbage, roasting meat, burning toast, and the occasional whiff of panic when something exploded. It was the olfactory biography of the household. Guests upstairs enjoyed delicate plates of mutton and puddings, but the true story of those meals was written in kitchen smoke. Every dish represented a small victory against both hunger and entropy. Of course, comfort came at a price. The kitchen was rarely clean by modern standards. Soot coated the walls, grease slicked every surface, and coal dust settled in the most improbable places, even inside the sugar tin. Heat and grime conspired to make the air thick. Cooks joked grimly that if you could breathe easily in a Victorian kitchen, you probably weren't working hard enough. It was a place where people sweated through winter, their faces flushed not from cheer, but from proximity to boiling cauldrons. Yet amid all this clatter and chaos, the kitchen had heart. When frost pressed against the windows and the rest of the house sulked in silence, the kitchen stayed alive, glowing, steaming, feeding. Children seeking warmth crept downstairs with excuses like can't sleep and were rewarded with a crust of bread or a spoon of soup. The servants pretended to scold them but secretly saved the best scraps. The kitchen was democracy by heat. where everyone, for a moment, belonged to the same species of cold-blooded creatures chasing warmth. Even animals knew it. Cats ruled the hearth, their tails flicking in slow approval. Dogs claimed the oven's corner as their throne. The kitchen was the Noah's Ark of the household, everything drawn to the same flickering flame. By the late 19th century, middle-class homes began installing smaller kitchen stoves, making the room slightly less infernal. Gas ranges appeared in advertisements, promising clean fire at the turn of a tap. But for most Victorians, the old iron range remained, stubborn and loyal. It was the first thing lit each morning and the last thing to die at night. When the family retired upstairs to icy bedrooms and the city outside froze in silence, one fire still burned below, steady, practical, alive. In that single glow lay the real warmth of the Victorian home. Not the polished parlour, not the marble mantel, but the sooty, smoky, beautiful chaos of the kitchen. It wasn't elegant, but it was human. And that, in the end, was the only warmth that mattered. Servants woke early to light fires and froze in silence while doing it, the unsung casualties of Victorian domestic warmth. Long before the family stirred, long before the first polite cough, in the parlour or the morning clatter of teaspoons, the servants were already at war with the cold. They didn't need alarm clocks, just the icy slap of 5 a.m. reality. The Victorian household ran on invisible labour, and nowhere was that more literal than in the business of heating. The family upstairs enjoyed the illusion of natural coziness, as if warmth simply emerged from the walls like divine grace. In truth, it came from a servant in the dark, kneeling before a dead hearth with numb fingers and a box of damp matches, praying the coal would catch this time. Servants' bedrooms, if one could call them that, were typically in attics or basements, both equally miserable. Attics turned into wind tunnels, basements into refrigerated caves. Their beds were hard, their blankets thin, and their wake-up call came not from comfort, but from the chill creeping into their bones. Before dawn, they crept downstairs through silent hallways, candle in hand, breath puffing visibly in the air. Their footsteps echoed because everything else was asleep, even the warmth. Their first task, coax the house back to life. Every morning was a race against time, a carefully choreographed routine of firelighting that had to be completed before the household woke. The cook lit the kitchen range first. It was the command centre of the home. Then came the butler's pantry, the scullery, and the water boiler for washing. Upstairs, housemaids moved from room to room like chilly ghosts, reviving parlours, studies, and bedrooms with fresh coal and kindling. There were dozens of fires to light in large homes, each with its own personality, each capable of rebellion. The tools of the trade were deceptively simple. A shovel, tongs, poker, and a bucket of coal. The art of firelighting required patience, dexterity, and a touch of masochism. First came the ashes, yesterday's debris, which had to be cleared carefully to avoid smothering today's flame. Then came the crumpled newspaper, the sticks, and finally the coal layered just so. Too much and the fire suffocated. Too little and it mocked you with smoke. Lighting one fire could take 10 minutes. Lighting 20 was a marathon, and you did it with frostbitten fingers on an empty stomach, while your breath condensed in front of your face like an unpaid spirit. Servants weren't allowed to make noise while working. Waking the household early was a punishable offence. So they worked in silence, muffling clinks and clatters, suppressing coughs as soot filled their lungs. It was a daily performance of invisible suffering. The only applause came later, when the mistress of the house descended to breakfast and commented approvingly, "How pleasant and warm it feels today." Clothing offered little comfort. Uniforms were made for propriety, not practicality. Thin cotton aprons, stiff collars, and sensible shoes that felt like refrigerated prisons. Some servants tied rags around their hands to keep warm, or wore 2 aprons at once. A few slipped hot bricks under their skirts while preparing the fires, a small act of rebellion that could mean the difference between endurance and hypothermia. For female servants, the day didn't stop once the fires were lit. It only began. They had to polish the grates, clean the ashpans, scrub soot off marble hearths, and polish brass fenders until they shone. The same fires that gave warmth also spat out endless dirt, and it was the servants who wiped away every trace. A well-kept hearth was a symbol of the mistress's virtue, but it was the maid's lungs that paid the price. Male servants didn't fare much better. The butler oversaw the ordering and delivery of coal, counting sacks as if they were gold bars. He kept a ledger of every fire in the house, noting which rooms were lit and when. Coal theft was a real concern, not from outsiders, but from within. Some desperate servants quietly pocketed a few lumps to warm their own quarters, an act treated as serious theft. The irony was cruel. They managed the household's heat, yet weren't allowed to share in it. The hours were relentless. A maid might start her shift before dawn and not finish until midnight, keeping fires fed throughout the day. They lugged coal scuttles up and down stairs, leaving trails of black dust on their skirts and hands. Their muscles ached, their backs burned, their nails cracked. And yet, when guests arrived, everything had to appear effortless. Warmth without visible labour, comfort without cost. The hallmark of good service was erasure. Evenings were no reprieve. As the family gathered by glowing fireplaces, servants lurked just outside the door, waiting for the call to add a little more coal. They entered quietly, heads bowed, and vanished again into the shadows. Downstairs, their own quarters remained cold. Fires for servants were considered extravagant. In some houses, they were permitted a small one in the kitchen indoors, not for comfort, but for work efficiency. If they wanted warmth after hours, they had to huddle near the dying range, the last embers of the day flickering over tired faces. Illness was inevitable. Constant exposure to cold led to chilblains, rheumatism, and servants' cough. Doctors prescribed rest, which was laughable, and warm tonics, which no one could afford. Many servants simply soldiered on, coughing soot and swallowing pain because the alternative was unemployment. There was always someone poorer waiting to take your place, someone whose fingers could still feel enough to light the morning fire. And yet, in rare quiet moments, servants found their own kind of pride. A perfectly set hearth, a fire that caught with one match, a household that woke to comfort. These were silent victories. They had built warmth from nothing, tamed the cold by sheer will. No portrait hung in their honour, no poem celebrated their endurance. But the truth of every cosy Victorian home burned quietly in their labour, in those shivering hours before dawn when the world was still frozen, and they alone kept the fires of civilization alive. So yes, the Victorians conquered winter, but not through innovation or architecture or empire. They conquered it through servants who rose in the dark, faced the cold, and lit the world for someone else. The wealthy basked in endless fireplaces and early central heating systems, where luxury meant never having to see your own breath indoors. In Victorian Britain, owning a country estate wasn't just about land or lineage. It was about temperature control. While the city poor measured warmth in minutes, the landed elite measured it in fireplaces. Nothing says luxury like having enough fireplaces to lose count, and staff to blame for it. Step inside a grand country estate in midwinter, and you'd find an architectural hymn to the art of combustion. Fireplaces in every room, drawing rooms, libraries, bedrooms, even corridors, each with its own marble mantel, ornate fender and personality. Guests would arrive wrapped in furs and leave there shivering at the door. The great hall blazed with a fire large enough to roast a stay, flames crackling beneath beams blackened by centuries of indulgence. Servants bustled like stagehands at an eternal play called Comfort for the Rich. Maintaining that illusion of endless warmth, however, required an army. Large estates employed entire hierarchies of heat management, housekeepers directing, butlers counting coal deliveries, and scullery maids tending embers in fireplaces so numerous that even the owners forgot some existed. Where does that chimney go? Was not a rhetorical question. Many mansions had so many flues that architects themselves gave up trying to trace them. The truly wealthy could have 50 or more active fires on a single estate. When the family said, "Light the house," it wasn't a phrase, it was an event. Coal arrived by the ton, delivered to the back of the property in carts so heavy they left trenches in the gravel drive. It was then distributed through the house via a labyrinth of cellars, scuttles, and weary servants. A well-run estate kept its coal records with near military precision. How much for the library, how much for the nursery, how much for his lordship's dressing room, which, naturally, required a constant blaze so he could think comfortably. Coal wasn't just fuel, it was inventory, prestige in mineral form. And yet, despite this apparent mastery over cold, the great houses weren't exactly cosy. High ceilings and vast rooms made heat a decorative suggestion rather than a guarantee. You could have 6 roaring fires and still feel a draft strong enough to rearrange your hairstyle. Guests learned to attend dinner in multiple layers, silk over wool, wool over resignation. Curtains were drawn heavy enough to block out daylight and possibly hope. Still, if you were cold, you could at least complain fashionably, something the poor never had time for. The wealthy didn't stop at fireplaces, they wanted innovation. The late 19th century brought early central heating systems, which sounded modern and behaved like medieval torture devices. Some estates experimented with hot air ducts, where a single furnace in the basement supposedly circulated warm air through iron pipes. The result was often one room at sauna-level heat and another so cold you could store beef in it. Servants called it the Lord's weather machine, mostly because it broke whenever the barometer did. Other households installed hot water systems, in which boilers pumped heated water through pipes connected to radiators, large, clunky iron beasts that hissed like offended cats. The wealthiest families treated them as curiosities, boasting to guests about our new warming apparatus, while quietly keeping the old fireplaces roaring anyway, just in case the system exploded. And sometimes it did. The most extravagant estates had underground heating channels, brick tunnels carrying hot air from furnaces to distant wings. In theory, these kept the floors toasty. In practice, they turned basements into unlivable saunas and warped the parquet. One frustrated lord wrote in his diary that "the wine has gone warm, the servants have gone faint, and yet my study remains arctic." Even luxury, it seemed, had drafts. But where technology failed, aesthetics triumphed. Fireplaces in country houses were less about necessity and more about spectacle. The drawing room hearth might feature a carved mantle of white marble inlaid with coloured stone or gold leaf. The library fire might glow beneath a grand oil painting of ancestors who were probably freezing in their portraits. In the music room, a delicately tiled grate matched the wallpaper, because nothing said refinement like coordinated combustion. The fire screen became another sign of taste, embroidered silk or lace barriers placed before the hearth to protect delicate complexions from the heat. Ironically, the fires often failed to produce much heat at all, but heaven forbid Lady Agatha's cheeks appear too pink. Maintaining the right shade of winter paleness was practically an Olympic event. Meanwhile, servants continued the unseen ballet of warmth management. In sprawling estates, lighting fires could take hours each morning. Ash had to be emptied, soot collected, grates polished. Coal scuttles were refilled in silence, like offerings to some fiery household deity. If a guest happened to comment on the pleasant temperature, the lady of the house smiled graciously, while somewhere below stairs a maid wiped sweat from her brow and tried not to pass out next to the furnace. Fire etiquette among the elite was also peculiar. A gentleman never tended the fire himself, that was the butler's job, unless the situation turned intimate, in which case a casual coal-tending gesture became socially flirtatious. Fires were instruments of mood, bright for dinner, subdued for late-night reading, and practically extinguished when moral restraint demanded it. The hearth was an emotional thermostat long before the mechanical kind existed. But for all their grandeur, these estates were not immune to irony. Many of the grandest houses, those that flaunted hundreds of fireplaces, stood mostly empty in winter. owners spent the coldest months abroad in Italy or France, leaving the staff behind to keep the house aired. So while the rich chased warmth across Europe, their estates sat in the English frost, vast mausoleums of soot and silence, each fireplace carefully tended for no one at all. Still, if warmth in Victorian England was a form of status, the country estate had achieved it in spectacular style. It was less about comfort and more about conquest, the triumph of wealth over weather, of architecture over biology. The glow of those countless fires wasn't just heat, it was proof of dominance. And yet, despite all the luxury, even the richest houses shared one truth with the poorest cottages. When the fires died, the cold came back, silent and democratic as ever. Money could buy coal, servants and boilers, but not immunity from winter. The empire may have ruled half the globe, but indoors everyone still bowed to the same frost. City dwellers choked on smoke and frost, their breath merging with industrial fog. In the Victorian city, the cold wasn't a season, it was a roommate. It seeped under doors, down chimneys, and into lungs with bureaucratic persistence. And in London, it came with a side of pollution so thick you could butter your toast with it. London air was so thick with smoke you could practically chew it for breakfast. For urban Victorians, winter was a full sensory experience. The sting of frost, the taste of soot, the constant sound of coughing echoing through narrow streets. The same coal that powered factories and lit homes also turned the air into something you could almost slice and serve. The famous London fog wasn't a quaint atmospheric quirk, it was an airborne cocktail of sulphur dioxide, soot and despair. Even Dickens, usually poetic about his grime, admitted the city sometimes mooked like a damp volcano. At street level, the chill mixed with filth to form a special kind of misery. The city was a labyrinth of ice-slick cobblestones, half-frozen gutters, and puddles of mystery origin. Horse manure froze solid, creating what one observer called a terrain both treacherous and fragrant. Pedestrians shuffled through the fog like ghosts who'd missed the afterlife. Gas lamps glowed dimly, struggling to pierce the gloom, while carriage wheels crunched over the frost with a sound that was half music, half warning. Inside, things weren't much better. The working-class houses of London, Manchester and Birmingham were marvels of density. Families stacked in tenements like layers of human lasagna. Heating such places was an art form born of desperation. A single fireplace, if one existed, had to warm everything, the front room, the kitchen, and the children's complaints. The coal used was usually low-grade and wet, producing more smoke than flame. Residents stuffed cracks with rags, old newspapers, and occasionally moral resolve. The wealthier city dwellers, merchants, clerks, and minor gentry, lived in terraced houses that boasted respectable fireplaces but offered little insulation. The fashionable tall ceilings and thin walls ensured that heat rose instantly to the ceiling and stayed there, mocking everyone below. The Victorians were fond of ornate plasterwork and elaborate cornices, but none of that stopped the draught sneaking in through the keyhole like a gossiping aunt. Winter mornings in the city were a slow-motion struggle. Families woke to frost on their windows, not outside but inside. Sheets stiffened overnight. Water in the pitcher turned to ice. Breakfast became a logistical puzzle. Should one light the fire first and wait an hour for the kettle to boil, or simply gnaw on cold bread and call it efficiency? Mothers scolded children to keep moving or freeze, which, to be fair, was sound advice. The cold was democratic, it respected no profession. Bakers, blacksmiths and bankers alike shivered at their posts. Shopkeepers wrapped themselves in shawls, counting coins with gloved hands. Clerks sat in unheated offices, dipping their pens into frozen ink and praying the boss's temper would thaw faster than the radiator, which, in most cases, didn't exist. Typists and telegraphists suffered from chilblain fingers, an occupational hazard that made the simplest work excruciating. Even the constables patrolling the night carried flasks more for morale than for law enforcement. Factories were no refuge. The massive industrial complexes that powered Britain's wealth were often just as cold as the streets outside. Steam machinery created bursts of heat near the engines, but most of the workspace remained an icy cavern filled with draughts and damp. Workers near furnaces roasted, those further away froze. The result was a human climate system entirely detached from nature, half sauna, half iceberg. And then there was the smoke. Every chimney, factory and gaslight added to the city's perpetual smog, turning daylight into a sickly yellow haze. The Great Fog of 1873, for example, was so dense that pedestrians couldn't see their own feet and drivers walked ahead of their carriages carrying lanterns. Crime spiked. Traffic halted, and one newspaper declared, "The air itself has gone solid." Even without record-breaking fog, the daily miasma coated lungs and laundry alike. Shirts dried grey, and doctors politely referred to the resulting coughs as climatic complaints. Street vendors, the city's winter warriors, endured the cold like soldiers on eternal duty. Costermongers selling roasted chestnuts or baked potatoes became beloved figures, partly because they doubled as public heaters. Crowds gathered around their carts, not for snacks, but for the brief ecstasy of proximity to warmth. Beggars huddled near them too, turning street corners into tiny ecosystems of survival. A man, a cart, a coal brazier, and 10 strangers pretending to browse. For the city's poorest, those in the rookeries and slums, there was no fire at all. Rooms with broken windows, damp walls and shared bedding offered little defence. Charitable organisations distributed coal or blankets, but supplies ran out long before the frost did. Some people sought warmth in train stations or factories. Others simply walked through the night, because stopping meant freezing. The morgue, grimly enough, saw an uptick in cold deaths every winter, recorded with Victorian understatement as found insensible in the street. And yet somehow the city endured. Markets stayed open, omnibuses trundled along through the murk, and chimney sweeps still clambered up sooty flues. The resilience of the urban Victorians bordered on absurd. They joked about pea soup fog and London lungs, as if the smog were a charming neighbour rather than a health hazard. Newspapers ran weather reports that read like battlefield updates: fog heavy, sun absent, city holding firm. By evening, when the gaslights flickered to life and the factories fell silent, the cold tightened its grip again. Families gathered around their meagre fires, the glow turning faces gold against walls blackened by smoke. Outside, the city exhaled, a giant organism breathing soot into the stars. The air might have been poisonous, the streets treacherous, but for the Victorians this was the price of progress. You could complain, but you couldn't leave, not unless you fancied living somewhere without empire, industry or frostbite. The urban cold wasn't just weather, it was character building. It toughened Londoners, Manchester mill workers and factory girls alike, shaping the stoic humour that became Britain's official survival mechanism. If you could make it through a Victorian winter in the city, you could make it through anything, except perhaps another Victorian winter in the city. Pollution and dampness combined to create the Empire's great respiratory plague, a fog so thick it entered history books, art and human airways alike. Victorian progress didn't just change the skyline, it changed the way people breathed. The Industrial Revolution gave Britain trains, wealth, an empire, and in return, it took everyone's lung capacity. Victorians didn't have lungs, they had built-in chimneys. By mid-century, the great cities of Britain had become test laboratories for how much filth a human body could inhale and still function. The air was an event, a visible, tangible substance that wrapped itself around everything. Londoners no longer looked at the fog, they lived inside it. The sun rose as a rumour, only occasionally piercing the yellow-brown gloom. Housewives hung out washing only to bring it back in dirtier than before. Doctors joked grimly that a healthy Londoner could expectorate a teaspoon of soot per day, which sounds like an exaggeration until you see a Victorian handkerchief. The Great Stink of 1858 gets most of the fame, when the Thames turned into a warm broth of sewage, so pungent it sent Parliament scurrying for scented handkerchiefs. But there was another crisis, just as pervasive and far more personal, the Great Chill. While the rivers festered below, the air above grew heavy with coal smoke and damp, creating the perfect environment for disease. Soot trapped moisture in every crevice, turning buildings clammy and lungs wetter still. Coughs became background noise. Hacking became a national pastime. Respiratory illness didn't discriminate. The poor wheezed in their tenements, the rich coughed politely in their drawing rooms, and everyone's handkerchiefs told the same sooty story. Chronic bronchitis, asthma, tuberculosis, these were the real empire builders, claiming more victims than war or famine. Doctors called it fog fever, the London cough, or, with clinical understatement, catarrhal malady. Even Queen Victoria herself was known to complain about the oppressive air of London. When the monarch can't breathe, you know it's bad. The problem wasn't just smoke, it was the combination of filth and damp. Cities like Manchester and Birmingham became rain-slick chimneys. Every surface was sticky with residue. Streets, curtains, and lungs all collected the same black dust. The damp air made everything heavier. Coal smoke clung low, forming a soup of sulphuric acid and fine particles. Victorians called it pea soup fog because humour is the last defence of a choking civilization. Medical journals of the era are full of horrific detail. Doctors reported children with blackened sputum and lungs that shed soot like chimney walls. Autopsies found carbon deposits so extensive that one surgeon described cutting through a city in miniature. The poor suffered worst, of course. Their houses lacked ventilation, and the fires they lit for warmth only added to the problem. Imagine heating your home by feeding poison into it. That was daily life. People tried to adapt in bizarre ways. Street vendors sold respirators, early face masks made from wire and sponge, meant to filter out the soot. They looked faintly ridiculous, somewhere between medieval plague doctor and malfunctioning teapot. Some ladies carried small handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar, which they pressed to their noses while out walking. It didn't help much, but it gave the impression of doing something, a very Victorian solution. Others swore by inhaling steam with spirits of ammonia, which, while dramatic, mostly just made you smell like laundry. Then there were the candles. During the worst fogs, households lit dozens of them at midday, turning homes into wax-scented caves. Gas lamps struggled to penetrate the haze, flickering weakly like stars drowning in soup. Carriages crawled through streets at a snail's pace, drivers calling out to avoid collisions. One observer in 1873 wrote, "I could not see my horse's head, and I only knew he was still there because he swore at me." Public health reformers began to realise that the British atmosphere was less natural and more man-made. Scientists started measuring soot levels and correlating them with death rates. The results were grim. Winter death tolls soared every time the fog settled in. The great smog events of 1873, 1880 and 1892 killed thousands quietly. Not in dramatic disasters, but in a slow collective suffocation. Death certificates read asthma, bronchitis, or simply exhaustion. But the truth was atmospheric. And yet, in true Victorian fashion, society learned to romanticise its own misery. Painters like Whistler and Turner transformed smog into art, capturing London's blurred horizons as aesthetic melancholy. Poets waxed lyrical about the golden mists of dawn, apparently unbothered by the fact that those mists were actively killing people. Tourists came to see the famous fog, to stroll through it, breathe it, and cough their way home with souvenirs of soot. There were attempts at reform. The Smoke Nuisance Abatement Act of 1853 tried to regulate emissions, but enforcement was laughable. Smoke inspectors were appointed but had no power, and often couldn't see the offending factories through the haze anyway. Industry shrugged. After all, black smoke was a sign of productivity. If your city skyline wasn't spewing poison, were you even contributing to the empire? By the century's end, the phrase "the Great Stink" and "the Great Chill" had merged into one reality. A country choking on its own success. The very coal that powered progress also powered decay. Engineers like Joseph Bazouget tackled the sewage problem with his monumental sewer system, but no one could build pipes big enough for the air. The soot and damp seeped everywhere, into lungs, linens, and literature. And so the Victorians carried on, coughing with dignity. They invented lace curtains, perhaps to hide the view, and wallpaper in darker shades to disguise the stains. The fog became their trademark, sinister, poetic, and utterly inescapable. It was the breath of empire itself, rising from chimneys and settling back down as penance. By the time the new century dawned, the smog had become myth. Artists loved it, writers used it, reformers cursed it, but no one forgot it. The great stink had shocked the nose, the great chill had scarred the lungs. Together they gave the world an image of Britain both mighty and miserable. A nation so powerful it could rule half the globe, yet so polluted it couldn't see across its own street. Tinkerers pursued progress through gas fires, steam heat, and explosive prototypes. The Victorian century burned with the confidence that science could solve anything, except apparently the problem of not catching fire while solving things. It was an age of restless innovation, where every gentleman with a moustache and a shed fancied himself the next Prometheus. Victorians invented everything except a safe way to use it. After centuries of living in cold, smoky rooms, the promise of modern heating was intoxicating. The Industrial Revolution had electrified the imagination, even before actual electricity arrived. Steam drove trains, gas lit the streets. Surely warmth could be engineered too. The result was a parade of prototypes that ranged from brilliant to mildly suicidal. The newspapers were full of hopeful advertisements. Clean, efficient, and perfectly safe. Words that in Victorian context usually meant the opposite. The first great innovation was the gas fire, a technological marvel, and a household hazard rolled into one. Instead of coal, it used coal gas pipe directly into homes, producing instant flames without the fuss of soot and shovels. For middle-class families, this was witchcraft made domestic. Imagine no coal scuttle, no ash pan, no coughing. Unfortunately, the first models had a distressing tendency to either explode or silently asphyxiate their owners. Gas leaks were common, safety valves optional, and early burners produced carbon monoxide like it was a design feature. Still, Victorians persisted. They reasoned that a little risk added excitement to the sitting room. Then came the steam heating systems, the industrial age's attempt at luxury. Inspired by the mighty engines of the railways, inventors realised that if steam could power locomotives, it could surely warm your wallpaper. They installed boilers in basements that fed hot pipes through the walls, bringing centralised heat to grand houses, hotels, and government offices. It sounded magnificent, modern, civilised, and hygienic. In practice, it was an adventure in pressure physics. Boilers burst, pipes hissed ominously, and radiators occasionally turned into projectile weapons. One landlord famously described his system as a triumph of heat distribution if one ignores the explosions. Not to be outdone, another faction of inventors experimented with hot water heating, an approach more refined and marginally less fatal. Instead of pressurized steam, it used circulating water to feed cast iron radiators. The first systems were clunky, noisy, and prone to developing personality. Some rooms became tropical greenhouses while others stayed as cold as Scotland in morning. Families learned to navigate their own homes by temperature. The tepid corridor, the sauna stairwell, and the frostbitten study. Meanwhile, the middle class, ever hungry for convenience, embraced portable heaters, small gas or oil devices advertised as ideal for ladies' dressing rooms. These delicate contraptions were neither safe nor efficient, but they did make thrilling headlines. A popular model, the Perfection heater, managed to ignite 3 separate curtains in its debut month. And still, customers bought more. Victorians loved the idea of control, the fantasy that human ingenuity could outwit the British climate, even if it occasionally burned down the parlour. Scientific journals buzzed with patents. inventors proposed air-warming engines, steam-driven grates, and automatic temperature regulators. One particularly confident gentleman designed a self-feeding coal stove that promised to sustain heat for 24 hours without human attendance. It sustained heat. All right, for the 3 minutes before it melted through the kitchen floor, the Victorians never met a hazard they didn't want to patent. But for all the mishaps, the spirit of experimentation was electric, even before electricity. Heating was more than comfort, it was progress embodied. To have a patented warming apparatus in one's home was to declare allegiance to the modern world. Gas companies hired elegant salesmen who demonstrated fires in top hats, assuring customers that only fools used coal. The public nodded, bought in, and then quietly installed a second fireplace, just in case the new one misbehaved. The medical profession, ever the opportunists, joined the craze. Doctors recommended mechanical warmth as a cure for everything from melancholia to indigestion. A gas-heated bath, they claimed, could invigorate the constitution. Unfortunately, it could also remove the eyebrows. Pamphlets extolled the benefits of steam rooms and electrothermal therapy, where currents of heat and electricity were applied directly to the body, occasionally with the effects best described as sizzling. Even public spaces began to embrace invention. Railway stations and department stores installed large central furnaces to keep patrons warm, a radical idea at the time. Visitors marvelled at being indoors without shivering. Newspapers hailed it as a victory for civilization over nature. Behind the scenes, engineers mopped up leaks, soot, and occasionally fainted from gas exposure. Progress, after all, demanded sacrifice. Then, toward the century's end, came the most audacious dream of all, electric heating. It began as spectacle, exhibitions of glowing coils, heating plates, and light bulbs that promised to make fire obsolete. "A house without flame," declared one enthusiastic inventor, "where warmth flows at the pull of a switch." Unfortunately, Victorian electricity was still the moral equivalent of lightning in a jar. Early electric heaters were rare, expensive, and occasionally fatal. Still, they symbolized what the era loved most, the belief that technology could domesticate the elements themselves. Despite the failures, the inventions laid the groundwork for the modern age. Gas fires became safer, radiators more efficient, boilers less explosive. The same spirit that made Victorians risk carbon monoxide for comfort also gave birth to the infrastructure that still heats cities today. They were reckless, ambitious, and gloriously certain that no problem was too dangerous to solve with more pipes. The truth is, the Victorians were never content just to survive winter. They wanted to outsmart it. Every hiss of gas, every sputtering radiator, every soot-stained patent drawing whispered the same defiant thought: we can build warmth better. They turned invention into religion, one fueled by optimism, soot, and the occasional small fire. By the dawn of the 20th century, the new generation inherited both the gadgets and the caution. The explosions were fewer, the fires more manageable, and the dream of clean heat a little closer. But the legacy of that era endures in every modern radiator hum and thermostat click, echoes of those soot-covered tinkerers who believed with absolute sincerity that progress could be set to medium heat. Daily survival tools became household icons of labour and grime. The coal scuttle and the ash bucket, two humble containers of soot and sweat, were as vital to Victorian life as bread and tea. They were the props in the great domestic drama of survival, the silent witnesses to every crackle, cough and curse that kept Britain warm. If you didn't have ash under your nails, were you even Victorian? To the modern eye, a coal scuttle looks decorative, the sort of antique you'd fill with pine cones or despair in a themed restaurant. But in its time, it was a status symbol with soot inside. Every home that burned coal, which meant every home that existed and needed one. It was the bridge between the coal cellar and the fire, between industrial power and domestic comfort. The scuttle carried civilization by the bucketful, usually up several flights of stairs. The average Victorian home had a coal hierarchy. At the bottom, the coal hole or cellar, a dark, damp pit where deliveries were dumped through an iron chute. It smelled of dust, moisture, and quiet dread. Above it, the coal scuttle, a smaller, more civilised cousin, waited near the fireplace like a loyal footman. Made of tin, brass, or polished copper, it came in shapes ranging from squat and practical to ornate and absurd. Wealthy families commissioned engraved scuttles that looked like small works of art, as if gilding the grime could make it less dirty. Poor families used battered pails or whatever tin could still hold weight. Either way, it was the same black treasure inside. The act of filling the scuttle was part workout, part ritual. Servants lugged heavy buckets from the cellar, climbing narrow stairs while coal dust clouded their breath. It was a daily pilgrimage to the god of combustion. Every room with a fireplace demanded a refill. The drawing room, the nursery, the master's study, even the hall where visitors pretended not to notice the smell of ash. The servant would kneel, pour the coal carefully, and retreat before anyone noticed the small black footprints left behind. And then there was the ash bucket, the unsung twin of the scuttle, because every fire that lived must die, and it died messily. Each morning began with the scraping of the grate, the clatter of iron tools, and the delicate process of sifting hot ashes without setting the rug on fire. The ashes were dumped into metal pails, grey ghosts of yesterday's warmth. These buckets were carried out through the servants' entrance, emptied into yards or bins, and occasionally used to mend paths or polish silver. Yes, ash could do both. The Victorians wasted nothing, not even yesterday's soot. Ash got everywhere. It snuck into hair, cuffs, and breakfast. Maids coughed it up. Housewives wiped it off curtains that had never seen a clean day. But it was also strangely intimate. Every handful of ash told a story of survival, of how long the fire had lasted, of who had sat closest to it. A thin layer on the hearth meant a cosy night. A thick one meant the family had gone to bed early to save coal. Even grime had its messages in the Victorian home. The tools of the trade, shovels, pokers, tongs and brushes, formed a little army beside every hearth. The poker, often polished to a ridiculous shine, was the sceptre of domestic authority. The shovel, meanwhile, did all the real work. Together with the scuttle and the ash bucket, they made up the household's most essential and dirtiest team. Manuals for good housekeeping included entire chapters on how to properly manage the fire's remains. It was science, art, and penance rolled into one chore. Of course, class shaped everything. For the rich, scuttles gleamed beside marble mantels, handled only by servants who knew better than to spill a speck on the carpet. For the poor, a coal bucket sat right in the middle of the single-room dwelling, doubling as a stool, a step, and occasionally a makeshift heater. Children played with the lumps like toys, and ashes were used to scrub pots clean. In middle-class homes where appearances mattered most, the coal scuttle was part of the decor, a gleaming vessel that said, "We're refined enough to burn responsibly." There were even social taboos around coal. Guests never touched the scuttle. That was the servants' domain. Housewives, however, were judged by how neatly it was kept. An overflowing scuttle suggested wastefulness. An empty one, negligence. The Illustrated Household Journal once advised, "A lady should never allow her scuttle to stand unattended. It betrays disorder." Victorian warmth came with moral expectations. Coal delivery itself was a spectacle. Men in soot-black coats hauled sacks through city streets, shouting "coal" in voices that rattled windows. They dumped their loads down iron chutes, leaving behind trails of dust and footprints like crime scenes. Children followed them, scavenging stray lumps that rolled away, a small fortune for the cold. Inside, servants coughed as they shoveled fresh coal into bins, the sound echoing through the pipes like the heartbeat of the house. By the late 19th century, manufacturers tried to elevate these grim necessities. Adverts boasted of ashless grates and dustless shovels, as if clean combustion were achievable with enough optimism. Some inventive souls even created self-cleaning fireplaces, mechanisms that turn the ashes into neat piles at the pull of a lever. They rarely worked, of course. Victorian innovation had a habit of stopping right before practicality. Still, the coal scuttle endured as a symbol of the age, equal parts utility and ugliness, a thing that touched every class and home. When the fire glowed bright, the scuttle stood proud beside it. When the fire went out, it was the last witness to warmth. Even in literature, it appeared again and again, sometimes as a weapon. Dickens used it for comic violence, sometimes as a metaphor for drudgery. Either way, it was never far from the centre of domestic life. By night's end, after the fire was damped down and the last embers stirred, the scuttle sat empty and the ash bucket full. Two halves of the same ritual. The day's warmth reduced to soot, waiting to be carried away before dawn. No one praised the coal carrier or the maid who cleaned the grate, but without them the house would freeze by morning. So when we picture the Victorian hearth, with its polished iron and gentle glow, remember the quiet labour that surrounded it, the clang of metal, the smell of ash, the black dust under nails. In the end, the coal scuttle wasn't just a container, it was a confession. It said, "We fought the cold today, and we won, barely." Luxury homes embraced early radiator system, elegant, leaky and unpredictable. After centuries of stoking, scraping and soot-choked coughing, Victorians dared to dream of a miracle. Warmth without fear. It was revolutionary. Heat that flowed invisibly through walls, powered by pipes and science, not by endless buckets of coal. It was like central heating, if you ignored the leaks, explosions and occasional steam burns. The radiator's rise was born from a very Victorian obsession, conquering nature with brass fittings and unearned confidence. The 19th century had already mechanised factories, cities and dinner parties. Why not warmth? Inventors and engineers, emboldened by the era's faith in progress, began experimenting with heating systems that would eliminate the dirty labour of tending individual fires. Their dream was simple: a single furnace, tucked discreetly away in the basement, circulating heat throughout the house like polite magic. The earliest systems appeared in grand public buildings, hospitals, train stations and government offices, places where fires in every room were impractical and where servants couldn't be trusted to do the stoking fast enough. Engineers adapted the same principle that drove steam engines: boil water, channel the steam through pipes, and let the heat radiate outward. It worked beautifully on paper. In reality, it worked like a moody relative, sometimes brilliant, sometimes catastrophic. The first steam radiators were metal beasts, heavy cast iron coils, ribbed and ornate, standing in corners like sulking furniture. They hummed and hissed ominously, occasionally spitting out boiling water like angry teapots. Pressure was the key and the curse. Too little and you got tepid air and complaints. Too much and you got a small household geyser. Servants quickly learned to listen to the system's temperament. A low hiss was comfort. A sharp clang meant run. Despite the danger, the idea caught on, particularly among the upper classes, who saw mechanical heating as both modern and moral. A house heated by steam, one advertisement boasted, is a house purified of grime and sloth. The rich were tired of soot-streaked mantles and the constant presence of servants in their rooms. Radiators promised privacy, warmth without witnesses, no maid bending awkwardly by the fire, no poker clanging mid-conversation. Just the civilised sigh of progress humming quietly beneath the wallpaper. But progress, as usual, came with quirks. Early systems leaked constantly, turning basements into indoor bogs. Radiators sweated rust down their sides, staining carpets and destroying wallpaper. Boilers required vigilant supervision, and one careless turn of a valve could transform a genteel home into a sauna. There are documented cases of pipes bursting under pressure and showering dinner guests with scalding steam. Engineers called it thermal enthusiasm. Everyone else called it a lawsuit. The sound of early heating was its own phenomenon. Radiators clanked, gurgled, and occasionally screamed in a symphony of hydraulic confusion. At night, the noises echoed through hallways like restless ghosts, causing servants to cross themselves and homeowners to question whether warmth was worth it. Yet, Victorians being Victorians, they refused to admit defeat. They simply declared the noises the sound of progress. Designers quickly realised that if radiators were going to live in polite society, they needed to look the part. Enter the age of ornamental heating. Manufacturers began producing cast-iron radiators shaped like Grecian columns, floral scrolls and curling vines. The wealthiest clients commissioned bespoke models in gold paint or porcelain enamel. Some were disguised entirely, hidden behind carved wooden screens or built into marble niches. Invisible heat became the new status symbol. The irony? Many of those hidden radiators promptly caused wallpaper to peel, floors to warp and upholstery to steam gently, like dumplings. For middle-class families, the radiator was an aspirational fantasy. It whispered of modernity, of urban sophistication. The idea that warmth could simply exist without labour was intoxicating. Those who couldn't afford full installations improvised with smaller versions, hot water coils or parlor radiators powered by individual stoves. They often leaked, hissed, and threatened to explode, but that was the price of keeping up with the Joneses boiler. Meanwhile, the gas companies grew nervous. Radiators threatened their beloved open-flame business model, so they retaliated with advertisements claiming that steam heat caused headaches, languor, and moral decay. Doctors were dragged into the argument, producing medical pamphlets warning of unnatural interior warmth, as if a cosy room might destroy the human spirit. Victorians believed them briefly, until the first cold snap hit, and suddenly moral decay didn't sound so bad. Servants, for their part, were sceptical. Boilers were notoriously temperamental, requiring constant feeding and cleaning. One moment the pipes were lukewarm, the next they were spewing lava. A maid's duties expanded to include boiler management, which was a polite way of saying potential martyrdom. Instructions were vague. Ensure steady heat, avoid explosion. That was it. Some estates employed specialised stokemen, whose job was to keep the system alive and the family's confidence intact. They worked in furnace rooms so hot and smoky they might as well have been training for Hades. Despite the risks, radiators became the defining emblem of late Victorian domestic modernity. Visitors marvelled at houses free of ash and smoke, with heat that seemed to emanate from nowhere. The upper class adopted the technology not just for comfort, but for aesthetic purity. Coal was for factories, steam was for civilization. Even so, most houses retained at least one traditional fireplace. For atmosphere, they said, though secretly it was in case the new system tried to kill them. By the 1890s, heating had become an architectural selling point. Builders advertised complete hot water installations as signs of progress. Radiator companies competed for prestige, printing catalogues filled with elegant illustrations and exaggerated promises. The systems got safer, quieter, and more efficient, eventually. But for a while, every hiss was a gamble, every clang a sermon and human overconfidence. The radiator was both triumph and trouble, proof that the Victorians could finally heat their homes without choking on soot, and a reminder that innovation never arrives without steam, sweat, and swearing. It was the final evolution of the century's obsession with taming cold, an invention that quite literally brought warmth to the walls. And though its early versions gurgled like haunted kettles and occasionally redecorated ceilings with boiling water, the radiator represented something far greater than comfort. It was the sound of the modern age beginning to hum, one puff of steam at a time. Single panes turned houses into iceboxes, with frost etching its own wallpaper. In the Victorian home, the window was both a marvel of light and a gaping hole through which warmth fled, screaming into the night. It was the architectural equivalent of a polite apology to winter. Do come in, the house is yours. You didn't need wallpaper and frost patterns decorated for free. To the Victorians, glass was progress, transparent proof that civilization had arrived. But progress had a chilling downside. The elegant slender window frames that made homes look refined also ensured they leaked heat like sieves. One pane of thin glass stood bravely and then uselessly between the family and the Arctic. No amount of coal, radiators, or moral fortitude could stop the cold from creeping through the glass and settling in your bones. In wealthier homes, the windows were vast and theatrical, designed to flood rooms with daylight, or more accurately grey British daylight, attempting its best. Architects loved tall sash windows that stretched nearly from floor to ceiling, perfect for admiring gardens, less perfect for maintaining circulation in your fingers. On winter mornings, condensation froze into delicate patterns, ferns, feathers, and crystalline forests that would have been charming if they weren't freezing your curtains solid. Children pressed their noses to the glass to marvel at the frost flowers, while their parents wondered how to pay the next coal bill. For the middle and working classes, smaller windows didn't mean warmer ones. Cheaper houses used thin, uneven glass that rattled with every gust of wind. If a pane cracked, families patched it with paper, rags, or whatever the newspaper's society section offered that week. Drafts whistled through gaps in the wooden frames, carrying with them a symphony of moans and creaks. Sleeping beside a window was a form of extreme sport. One side of your face froze while the other roasted near the fire. Victorian attempts to battle the window problem were equal parts creativity and denial. The simplest fix was the heavy curtain, a fabric fortress that transformed windows into theatrical backdrops. Velvet, damask, or wool, they were so thick they could have doubled as soundproofing in an artillery range. During the day, they framed sunlight like artwork. At night, they were drawn tight enough to keep out drafts, ghosts, and possibly visiting relatives. Still, even the best curtain couldn't seal off the icy aura of a Victorian window. Behind it, cold air pooled like invisible fog, waiting for a chance to escape into the room. Those with money and optimism turned to innovation. In the 1870s, double glazing was rumoured to exist in America, and the British elite eyed it suspiciously, as though warmth itself might be unpatriotic. Instead, they invented secondary sashes, removable inner frames fitted for winter. These wooden panels trapped a small cushion of air, which in theory created insulation. In practice, it created condensation so dramatic it could rain indoors. Servants spent mornings mopping puddles off windowsills while pretending it was part of the cleaning schedule. Meanwhile, the condensation problem had its own social class. For the poor, damp meant mildew and illness. For the rich, it meant unsightly streaks on imported silk drapery. Either way, it was relentless. Window glass was a magnet for moisture. On especially cold nights, frost formed on the inside, gluing curtains to the panes. Some households left the frost untouched because it looked picturesque. Others scraped it off using knives, spoons, or sheer rage. Then there were the ventilators. Victorians, paradoxically, feared both drafts and stagnant air. Doctors warned that sealed rooms caused miasmas, mysterious bad airs blamed for everything from headaches to moral decline. Thus, inventors created tiny metal vents installed near window frames, allowing just enough fresh air in to make everyone miserable. They satisfied no one. Too small to prevent suffocation, too large to prevent pneumonia. Housewives adjusted them obsessively, muttering that no one ever died from a bit of breeze while catching their fourth cold of the month. At night, the temperature drop turned every window into a science experiment. Water in wash basins froze solid, curtains stiffened, and window locks frosted shut. Housemaids tasked with opening the morning shutters had to pry them loose with bare, red fingers. In some houses, a thin sheet of ice formed between curtain and pane, creating a private glacier. And yet, there was beauty in it, a fleeting gallery of frost artistry that vanished with the first sunbeam, or the cook's first shout from the kitchen. Urban homes faced a double curse, the cold and the grime. Windows caught the city's soot like lungs caught its air. Cleaning them was an act of masochism, performed with vinegar, newspaper, and regret. Soot stuck to the condensation, forming grey streaks that no amount of scrubbing could erase. "A clean window," one London housewife lamented, "is but a temporary miracle." Window cleaning became an endless war against physics and coal. Despite all this, Victorians loved their windows. They were portals to weather, gossip, and respectability. A bright, well-dressed window told the neighbourhood you were thriving, or at least pretending to. Women spent hours arranging lace curtains to perfection, ensuring they suggested both chastity and ambition. In poorer districts, families hung old sheets for privacy, and the faint flicker of candlelight behind them said more about endurance than decoration ever could. The irony, of course, was that the more beautiful the house, the worse the window problem became. Those massive arched glass panes in Gothic mansions looked magnificent but performed like sieves. The grander the view, the colder the toes. Even castles weren't immune. Scottish lairds complained of frost forming inside the turrets, despite roaring fires large enough to roast entire clans. By the end of the century, newspapers began reporting on window reform, the early push for double glazing, rubber seals, and thicker glass. But real change would come slowly, long after the coal age ended. The Victorians, ever practical in their suffering, simply learned to live with the cold. They drew the curtains tight, pulled up another blanket, and admired the frost ferns as though they were art, and in a way they were. Nature's revenge, etched delicately across the glass, reminding everyone that no matter how clever the machinery below, winter still had the final word. Endless shawls, flannel, and wool transformed survival into style. If there was one thing the Victorians knew how to do, it was layer. Every chilly bone, every draughty hallway, every frost-bitten morning inspired new garments and accessories, not out of vanity but sheer necessity disguised as taste. Victorian fashion wasn't about elegance, it was about survival wrapped in lace. The Victorian body was an architectural project, an ongoing construction of warmth. Layer upon layer, like geological strata of modesty and misery. The average respectable woman wore so many garments at once that getting dressed was closer to assembling an onion than putting on clothes. There were chemises, drawers, petticoats, corsets, flannel undershirts, bust improvers, crinolines, bodices, and at least one shawl for moral insulation. The end result, a human quilt simultaneously elegant and immobile. Winter only made things worse, or warmer, depending on your optimism. Flannel became the fabric of the century, praised by doctors and moralists alike. "Nothing protects the constitution like flannel," wrote one Victorian health guide, as though it were a form of spiritual armour. Whole families swore by it. Babies were swaddled in it, invalids slept under it, and the elderly wore it as if fearing the reaper might catch them underdressed. Even undergarments were lined with the stuff, turning every movement into a gentle exfoliation. Men too embraced the flannel life. Gentlemen's outfitters sold winter vests of moral sturdiness, meaning thick wool undershirts that could double as punishment devices. A fashionable man might appear dashing in his tailored coat and waistcoat, but underneath lurked layers of itchy pragmatism. Beneath that polished exterior was a furnace of discomfort. One London tailor famously advertised flannel drawers that safeguard the health while flattering the form, which sounded noble until one imagined the chafing. For the working classes, layering was less about propriety and more about pure physics. With houses barely heated and outdoor labour unavoidable, people wore whatever they could find, one dress over another, coats over shawls, over scarves, over hope. Rag pickers and dock workers stuffed newspapers into their boots for insulation, creating the 19th century version of DIY thermal wear. Children went to school in patch jackets that weighed more than they did. When fashion magazines spoke of winter chic, most city dwellers were too busy trying to thaw their fingers to care, but even poverty couldn't entirely smother the Victorian sense of presentation. Street vendors and washerwomen wrapped themselves in bright shawls, often patterned with paisley or tartan. These shawls were more than garments. They were armour against wind and judgment. A good shawl could mean the difference between dignity and frostbite. In working-class London, women prided themselves on how they carried their warmth, a phrase both literal and metaphorical. Blankets were equally essential, though for most Victorians they were few and far between. Wealthy households stocked entire linen cupboards of them, heavy wool blankets for the beds, lighter throws for carriages, and lap robes for chilly evenings by the fire. These were often embroidered or fringed, transforming the mundane act of not freezing into an aesthetic event. Servants, meanwhile, made do with whatever scraps trickled down: old shawls, worn sheets, or rugs so rough they could exfoliate skin by proximity. In the countryside, hand-knitted garments became winter lifelines. Knitting circles produced mountains of mittens, scarves and socks, many destined for soldiers or sailors braving even worse climates. The humble knitted muffler, a long, narrow scarf wrapped 3 times around the neck, was as common as the cough it failed to prevent. One Scottish farmer reportedly wore so many layers of wool he could survive the blizzards of hell itself. The sheep presumably felt avenged. Even fashion trends bowed to the chill. Cloaks and capes swept through society in a flurry of velvet and fur. A lady's winter ensemble might include a paletot, a tailored coat with the aerodynamic grace of a sofa, a muff the size of a small badger, and a bonnet lined with feathers for thermal uplift. The silhouette was less feminine grace and more portable greenhouse. Still, fashion magazines insisted on elegance. A lady must suffer no loss of poise even when encased in wool. One can only imagine how many fainting couches were ruined by overheating. For men, outerwear became a mark of both class and character. The heavy greatcoat, woolen double-breasted and lined with fur, was standard for those who could afford it. A top hat added no warmth whatsoever, but it did communicate confidence while your ears froze off. Gentlemen also adopted travelling rugs, enormous blankets carried in carriages or on trains, ideal for napping through both cold and convestion. A man wrapped in one looked like he was about to conquer the Arctic, or at least the Reading Line. At night, the layering continued. Bedtime fashion was a fortress: flannel nightshirts, wool socks, and the ever-romantic nightcap. Husbands looked like elderly poets, wives like Victorian ghosts. No one was alluring, everyone was alive. Even the wealthiest couples turned in beneath mountains of bedding, wool, eiderdown, quilts, counterpanes, enough to crush small pets. Children disappeared under their covers like hibernating hedgehogs. The irony, of course, was that all this layering became fashionable. Flannel went from health necessity to social statement. Shawls became family heirlooms. Cloaks evolved from mere blankets with buttons into couture. The colder the climate, the more opulent the wardrobe. The Victorians somehow managed to make frostbite look aspirational. Still, beneath the lace, the flannel, and the 12 petticoats lay a shared truth. Warmth was survival, and survival could be styled. A good outfit wasn't just about looking respectable, it was about enduring a world that refused to heat itself. Every shawl was a small rebellion, every blanket a declaration that civilization might freeze, but fashion never would. And so, in the flicker of the hearth or the hiss of the radiator, the Victorian figure stood resplendent, puffed, padded, and bundled within an inch of mobility. They were not dressed for beauty, they were dressed for war, the daily war against the cold. And somehow in their absurd layering and lace-trimmed resilience, they won it, one flannel undershirt at a time. Curtained beds offered privacy and insulation from freezing air, the Victorian answer to both modesty and frostbite. The canopy bed was not just a statement of luxury, it was a fortress, a cocoon, and occasionally a fabric coffin. Because nothing says comfort like turning your bed into a personal coffin. To understand the Victorian obsession with bed curtains, you must first imagine the average winter bedroom, vast, unheated, and full of decorative regret. The fire, if there was one, lived halfway across the room, valiantly attempting to heat a space designed by an architect who clearly despised circulation. Walls dripped condensation, windows hissed cold drafts, and every inhale felt like sipping on icicles. Into this frozen void came the bed, a 4-poster shrine to survival. The bed curtains weren't a mere flourish. They were a vital piece of domestic engineering. Heavy drapes of velvet, damask, or thick wool hung from carved wooden frames, transforming the bed into a small room within a room. When drawn, they trapped what little warmth the sleeper produced, turning body heat into central heating by sheer determination. In large country houses, where ceilings seemed designed to mock human warmth, a curtained bed could mean the difference between waking refreshed and waking embalmed. But the allure of bed curtains wasn't just thermal, it was social. The Victorians loved privacy almost as much as they loved overcomplicating it. Bedrooms were not entirely personal spaces. Servants entered freely, sometimes hourly, to stoke fires or deliver hot bricks. The curtains offered not just warmth, but a small sanctuary, a space where one could exist unobserved, unjudged, and undressed. It was the closest a respectable Victorian ever got to solitude. For the wealthy, these beds were masterpieces. Mahogany frames carved with flowers and cherubs, canopies embroidered with crests or biblical scenes, tassels and fringes dangling like status symbols. A well-dressed bed said more about your class than your coat ever could. Manuals of domestic elegance advised that the bed is the centerpiece of comfort and taste. Its dressing reflects the refinement of the household. In other words, if your bed didn't look like it belonged in a cathedral, were you even trying? The truly extravagant models came with layers of fabric so thick they muffled sound entirely. Some guests reported that drawing the curtains felt like entering a tomb of velvet silence. The air grew still, the light dim, and the faint scent of lavender water mingled with coal smoke. It was cosy, yes, but in a vaguely claustrophobic, I may not wake up sort of way. Middle-class families, ever aspiring, and bathed the curtain cays with enthusiasm and limited budgets. Their beds featured simpler muslin or calico hangings, often in cheerful floral prints to disguise the mould creeping up the wallpaper. These curtains might not have kept out much cold, but they provided a powerful illusion of warmth. The psychological comfort was half the point. A person could freeze in style at least. For the working class, things were less decorative and more practical. In overcrowded homes and boarding houses, curtained beds served as portable privacy screens. A few planks, some spare cloth, and you had your own room within a shared one. It was a miracle of economy. One bed, 3 people, and 4 curtains separating them from each other's snoring. The damp might seep in, but at least you didn't have to make eye contact while suffering it. The Victorians even extended the concept beyond the home. In hospitals, ships, and railway sleeping compartments, bed curtains became institutionalised, the respectable way to separate bodies in close quarters. The curtain signalled decency, a soft fabric line between intimacy and impropriety. In an age terrified of scandal, a bit of drapery was the ultimate moral insulation. Yet, as with all Victorian fads, excess crept in. Some curtains were so thick they trapped not just warmth, but everything else, including dust, mildew, and the occasional spider. Physicians began to complain that stagnant air in curtained beds caused respiratory issues, faintness, and fevers of confinement. One hygiene crusader warned that the curtained bed is but a muffled coffin for the living. Predictably, this only made them more popular. Nothing thrilled the Victorians like a moral dilemma wrapped in tassels. Servants, of course, were the ones who paid for all this comfort, literally in sweat. Every week, they had to dismantle, shake out, and re-hang the enormous fabric draperies, often while standing on wobbly ladders in freezing rooms. Dust cascaded down like volcanic ash. Curtains absorbed smoke from lamps, soot from fires, and every odour the household produced. A truly grand bed could require half a day of labour to clean properly, and by evening it smelled of coal again. For travellers, the bed curtain was both a comfort and a curse. Inns and guest houses boasted well-curtained beds in advertisements, promising warmth and privacy. What they didn't mention was that these curtains also trapped centuries of previous guests' exhalations. Some travellers refused to sleep in them, preferring to freeze rather than marinate in ancestral breath. Others simply drew them tight and hoped for the best, muttering prayers to St. Flannel. By the late 19th century, as homes grew smaller and central heating, or at least its noisy cousin, the radiator, became more common. The bed curtain began to fade from fashion. Hygiene reformers waged war against dusty hangings, calling them germ traps of the boudoir. The modern bedroom emerged, brighter, cleaner, and infinitely colder. Curtains gave way to open iron bedsteads and minimalist sensibilities, progress, at the expense of comfort. But nostalgia clung to the curtained bed. Artists painted them, novelists romanticised them, and the upper classes refused to give them up entirely. There was something irresistibly theatrical about pulling those heavy drapes, extinguishing the lamp, and vanishing into your own private world of warmth and whispers. For the Victorians, the bed curtain was more than fabric. It was philosophy. It represented the eternal human struggle to carve a pocket of comfort out of a hostile world. Within those folds of velvet and lace, they created tiny sanctuaries against the cold, the noise, and the chaos of life. And while modern bedrooms may boast cleaner air and thermostats, they've lost that peculiar intimacy, that feeling of stepping into a warm, self-contained universe. The Victorians may have slept in fabric coffins, but at least they were cosy ones. Winter streets vanished in fog, ice, and manure, turning travel into adventure. The Victorian city in winter was not so much a place as an obstacle course designed by someone with a grudge against human knees. Cobblestones froze solid, gutters turned into black rivers of slush, and the fog rolled in so thick it felt personal. If you saw your neighbour in winter, it meant you'd both taken a wrong turn in the same fog. Victorian winter was democratic in its cruelty. It didn't care whether you were a duke or a dustman. The moment you stepped outside, the air slapped you with the enthusiasm of an unpaid tax collector. The cold bit through wool, the damp clung to bones, and the streets themselves turned into conspirators. In London, the great enemy was the fog, not the poetic kind beloved by painters, but the industrial monstrosity locals called pea soupers. These were not mists, but events. You could taste them, you could wear them, sometimes you could even trip over them. By morning, the city's skyline vanished entirely. Chimneys, steeples, and street lamps melted into a single beige void. Drivers walked ahead of their horse-drawn carriages carrying lanterns, calling warnings like sailors lost at sea. Shopkeepers hung bells on doors just to hear if someone had entered, since seeing was out of the question. The air grew so thick with soot and moisture that you could write your name on your coat just by standing still for 5 minutes. And then there was the ice. Cobblestone streets froze overnight, transforming into skating rinks of misery. The morning rush to work became a ballet of slipping humanity. Men in top hats performed involuntary acrobatics, while women in long skirts discovered just how aerodynamic crinolines were when caught by gravity. Street sweepers sprinkled sand and ashes, but mostly they just created fashionable grey mud. Falling was a classless activity. Everyone did it eventually. The difference was that the rich fell gracefully, and the poor fell into manure. Ah yes, manure, the Victorian street's most reliable decoration. Horses powered the city, and winter didn't stop them. Their daily deposits froze solid, forming a landscape of treacherous lumps. Carriage wheels ground it into an icy paste, turning every crossing into a battlefield. One must choose between stepping in filth or falling upon it, grumbled a journalist in 1879. The choice was rarely clear until it was too late. Street vendors and cabmen bore the brunt of it. For them, cold meant endurance, not inconvenience. Flower girls' fingers turned blue clutching their baskets. Costermongers selling hot potatoes were surrounded by grateful hands that came for warmth first, food second. Cab drivers wrapped themselves in every blanket they owned, their breath freezing on their moustaches as they waited for passengers who would complain about the chill inside. Horses shivered beside them, their breath steaming like locomotives. Even the police, those stoic guardians of order, suffered in the cold. The Metropolitan Police Gazette recorded entire winters of constables fainting from exhaustion while standing post in the fog. Many were issued cloaks so heavy they could double as tents, yet the cold crept in anyway, settling in the joints, the lungs, the will. Constable Frost, as the papers joked, never sleeps. The wealthy faced a different kind of winter struggle: transportation. Carriages were glamorous in summer but miserable in sleet. Wheels skidded, horses panicked, and drivers vanished into fog like ghosts with unfortunate timing. Sleighs were briefly fashionable among the upper class, but only in the rare moments when snow stuck long enough. They looked magnificent: red velvet seats, jingling bells, fur-lined blankets, but they also made their riders look faintly ridiculous when pulled by horses plodding through grey London slush instead of pristine snowdrifts. For pedestrians, winter walking became a daily act of courage. Frostbite was real, though it was called more poetically chilblains of the extremities. Doctors recommended vigorous motion to restore circulation, which was sound advice since the average person spent most of the day vigorously running from cold puddles. Gloves soaked through instantly, scarves froze stiff, and noses turned the same shade as the brickwork. Umbrellas designed for rain drooped uselessly under freezing drizzle. Nightfall made things worse. The gas lamps, feeble enough in clear weather, flickered like dying fireflies in the fog. The world shrank to a few glowing orbs and the sound of unseen hooves. Pickpockets thrived, and the fog was their camouflage, and the cold made everyone too slow to chase them. "The city in winter," wrote one diarist, "is a theatre of silhouettes and coughs." In the poorer districts, the cold claimed real victims. Homeless men and women huddled beneath railway arches or by the banks of the Thames, clutching bottles of gin that froze before they could finish them. Charities distributed soup and coal, but there was never enough. Workhouses overflowed, their beds shed in shifts. The newspapers published grim lists of frozen foundlings, lives extinguished quietly in alleys, beneath the same fog that hid the gaslight. It was the part of winter Victorian society preferred not to see, and conveniently couldn't. Yet amidst all this bleakness, the streets still pulsed with strange vitality. Children skated on frozen puddles, newsboys hurled snowballs at passing cabs, and lovers held gloved hands under flickering lamps. The cold, in its awful way, made people visible. Faces red, breath visible, laughter clouding the air. The city shivered together. And if you stopped long enough beside a chestnut seller's brazier or a pie stall, you could almost believe warmth was contagious. When spring finally crept in, shy, muddy and late, the fogs lifted, the ice melted, and the manure returned to its summer state, unpleasant but at least liquid. Londoners emerged blinking into the light, coughing soot but triumphant. They'd survived another season of frozen chaos, one slippered step at a time, and when the next winter came, as it always did, they faced it again with scarves wound twice around their necks, a resigned grin, and the eternal Victorian motto: keep calm, keep walking, and try not to fall in anything that steams. Britain's skies turned grey from industry's endless fires. From London to Leeds, Manchester to Glasgow, the Empire's success rose daily into the heavens in the form of black fumes and civic pride. It was the perfume of progress, dense, choking, and inescapable. If the sun looked grey, congratulations, the economy was booming. The Victorians lived beneath a ceiling of their own creation. Industrial chimneys sprouted like iron trees, belching smoke from dawn to dusk. Every factory, workshop and railway pumped its contribution into the national atmosphere until the sky resembled a well-used teapot. Travellers arriving by train could tell they'd reached Britain long before the station. The smell of coal hit first, sharp and sour, a national trademark you could taste. The smoke age had become an unspoken badge of honour. Clean air was for the idle or the French. The true measure of British greatness was how black your skyline could get before daylight gave up entirely. Politicians and industrialists boasted that the very air shimmered with productivity. "Our prosperity," declared one factory owner proudly, "is written upon the clouds." His workers, coughing in the courtyard, might have agreed, though not in the same tone. In London, the smoke problem was biblical. The capital was a living chimney. Every household fire added its puff to the collective gloom, and every passing train offered a fresh contribution. The result was a permanent twilight, a city illuminated by the weak gold of gaslight even at noon. Foreign visitors described it as both magnificent and miserable. The American writer Nathaniel Hawthorne noted that London is as grand as a dream and as dirty as a nightmare. The fogs that rolled in each winter weren't natural mists at all. They were chemical events brewed from sulphur, soot and water vapour. Victorians romanticised them, of course. Painters adored the haze, poets swooned over its melancholy beauty, and novelists used it as shorthand for mystery and sin. But beneath the literary charm, it was an ecological horror show. Soot settled on everything, buildings, furniture, lungs and morals alike. Curtains turned grey, white dresses became beige by evening, and even the pigeons looked ashamed. For the working class, living near factories meant breathing the economy directly. Entire neighbourhoods disappeared under constant smog. Laundry never dried properly. Meat hanging in butcher shops turned black by midday. The air was said to have body. You could almost chew it. Children played in soot-slick streets, their laughter punctuated by coughing fits that sounded alarmingly adult. By their teens, most had lungs that resembled Victorian wallpaper, decorative, crumbling and full of dust. Yet industry marched on. Coal was king, not just fuel, but philosophy. It powered trains, factories, and even morality. To burn coal was to participate in empire, to contribute to progress. Clean air reformers were dismissed as hysterics who probably didn't appreciate prosperity. "What's a little smoke?" asked one newspaper editorial in 1862, "compared to the might of the British nation?" The answer, as it turned out, was about 2 million premature deaths. But who's counting? Still, the smoke had its defenders. Artists found inspiration in it. James Whistler painted the smog as soft harmony. Turner turned it into sunlight with commitment issues. Poets called it the Vale of Albion. There was something hauntingly sublime about a skyline blurred by industry, beauty born from combustion. It was as if Britain had built its own weather, one powered by ambition and ash. Even the wealthy couldn't fully escape the coal-smoked sky. Their country estates might have fresher air, but visits to London quickly restored that trademark cough. Architects tried to fight back with innovations like ventilating windows, chimney filters, and even smoke-consuming fireplaces, a marvellous concept that never worked. The rich draped white linens and upholstery as if to mock fate. Within days, everything turned the colour of weak tea. Servants dusted continuously, their efforts defeated by every breath of outdoor air. In the industrial north, the transformation was even starker. Cities like Sheffield, Leeds and Birmingham became perpetual sunsets of orange haze. Daylight there was an act of imagination. Travellers reported arriving under darkness at noon. The rivers turned thick and metallic, reflecting not the sky, but the factories themselves. Locals joked, grimly, that their cities had two colours, grey and darker grey. The effects weren't confined to aesthetics. Smoke-poisoned crops corroded iron railings and eroded entire stone facades. St. Paul's Cathedral grew blacker each year, until it looked less like a church and more like an enormous lump of coal repenting. Birds fled the cities, and flowers withered before blooming. Victorian gardeners developed a new horticultural category, the soot-resistant plant. Geraniums and ivy survived. Everything else surrendered. The smell was omnipresent, a mix of sulphur, damp and ambition. Visitors described it as a burning library or the perfume of engines. Clothes absorbed it instantly. Even indoors it clung to hair, fabric and conversation. Letters from the time describe hosts apologising for the London odour, as if their entire city had developed a personality problem. When fog thickened, people lit extra fires to dry the air, which only made it worse, a national cycle of self-sabotage conducted cheerfully. Eventually reformers began to push back. The Smoke Nuisance Abatement Acts of the 1850s and beyond attempted to fine factories for excessive emissions, but enforcement was as weak as the winter sun. Inspectors couldn't see the chimneys through the haze, and besides, shutting down smoke meant shutting down business. The government preferred to cough politely and move on. Yet beneath the grime, the Victorians were aware of what they'd lost. Diaries from the countryside often describe returning travellers marvelling at the clarity of the stars, a sight invisible in the cities. Children in London sometimes thought the moon was a rumour. Clean air became a luxury item, sought on holidays to Brighton or Bath, where one could finally breathe without crunching. The coal-smoke sky was more than pollution. It was an identity. It represented the paradox of the age. Brilliance achieved through self-destruction. The Victorians built railways, empires and fortunes under that grey dome, never realising that the same smoke that lit their furnaces was quietly dimming their world. When the wind shifted and the haze lifted for a day, Londoners would pause, astonished at how blue the sky could be. Then they'd smile, strike another match and get back to work. Because progress, in the Victorian imagination, wasn't measured in sunlight, it was measured in smoke. Bathhouses, soup kitchens and workhouses offered fleeting heat for the desperate, a few stolen hours of relief from the frost, bought with humility, hunger or humiliation. Victorian charity was many things, moral, bureaucratic, occasionally well-meaning, but warm it was not. In an age that believed poverty was a personal failing, warmth itself became a privilege. For those at the bottom, survival depended not on hearth or home, but on finding the nearest patch of public heat. Nothing warms you like boiling despair. By the mid-19th century, London's streets were full of the shivering and the dispossessed. The industrial boom had drawn thousands from the countryside into the cities, only for the economy to remind them that progress didn't come with central heating. The poor huddled under railway arches, crowded into lodging houses that smelled of damp humanity, or simply walked through the night to keep their blood moving. But when even that failed, they turned to the few institutions that promised both warmth and salvation: the bathhouse, the soup kitchen, and the workhouse. The public bathhouse was a minor miracle of Victorian reform, born not from compassion but from hygiene panic. The upper classes decided that the poor were too dirty to be trusted with civilization. Thus, in 1846, Parliament passed the Public Baths and Wash Houses Act, allowing local councils to build facilities where cleanliness could be imposed, one soapy citizen at a time. These were grand affairs, long halls lined with tiled cubicles, boilers roaring in the basement, steam fogging the air until even morality felt damp. For a penny, you could wash the soot of survival off your skin and feel human for 10 blessed minutes. The water wasn't exactly warm, more lukewarm if you hurry, but compared to the freezing water pump on your street, it was luxury. Women came with children, men came with shame, and everyone left with steam in their hair and a sense that perhaps civilization wasn't entirely theoretical. Some bathhouses even had slipper baths, small coffin-shaped tubs where one could soak privately while contemplating whether life was worth the additional penny for soap. The smell of boiled flannel and coal lingered in the air, mingled with that faint scent of municipal virtue. Reformers boasted that these bathhouses would uplift the working class. The poor, however, saw them for what they were, brief islands of warmth in a cold, indifferent empire. And when they left, skin pink and clothes still damp, the chill outside hit like betrayal. Then there were the soup kitchens, temporary sanctuaries where charity met cuisine with predictable results. Established during harsh winters, they offered ladles of thin broth, hunks of bread, and sometimes a sliver of meat if the donor was feeling magnanimous. The atmosphere was less restaurant and more mass-feeding experiment. The steam rising from the vats fogged windows, softened tempers, and for a moment almost felt like kindness. People queued for hours in the snow for one bowl, tin mugs in hand, breath mingling in the air like collective prayer. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, dogs waited hopefully near doorways, and volunteers, earnest, overdressed, and slightly horrified, ladled out morality along with the soup. Eat and be grateful, the system seemed to say, but don't get comfortable. The Victorian elite loved soup kitchens because they were theatrical. They turned compassion into an event. Newspapers ran illustrations of noble ladies handing bowls to ragged children, all soft lighting and humility. No one mentioned the flavour, which by all accounts resembled warm surrender. Still, it was something, and in a city where warmth usually came at the price of coal or dignity, a few spoonfuls of heat mattered. But for many, the last resort was the workhouse, Britain's frost-resistant monument to moral arithmetic. The Poor Law of 1834 had declared that relief should be less eligible than labour. In other words, life inside must always be worse than life outside. The result, massive institutions where poverty was processed, sorted, and supervised. And yet, on the coldest nights, even the workhouse seemed merciful. People arrived in rags, desperate not for charity but for temperature. Inside, the fires burned constantly, not for comfort, but efficiency. The heat was rationed, like everything else. The air was thick with the smell of boiling porridge, wet wool, and disinfectant. Men and women were separated, their belongings confiscated, their humanity filed under temporary. But at least they were warm. Inmates often slept on straw pallets near the walls, where draught still crept through, or near the great iron boilers that hissed all night. Those closest to the furnace roasted, those farthest froze. It was a metaphor in architecture. For every person who dozed in the warmth, another coughed beneath a blanket of state-approved inadequacy. Even outside the institutions, the poor improvised their own public warmth. They clustered around bakery doors where ovens exhaled delicious heat into the street. They lingered near factory vents or stood close to horses for shared body heat. Chimney outflows, ironworks, and even sewer grates became survival spots, each one a grim reminder that warmth could be found but never owned. The moralists insisted that such suffering built character. Clergymen preached that cold bodies led to warm souls, though few volunteered to test the theory. Philanthropists hosted winter drives collecting blankets, coal and self-satisfaction. Even Charles Dickens, whose sympathy ran deeper than most, knew that Victorian warmth was always conditional, charity wrapped in red tape and sermons. Yet in the dim corners of bathhouses and soup kitchens, something human persisted. Laughter cracked through the steam. Strangers shared bread. Children played with their reflection in puddles on the tiled floors. The warmth may have been temporary, but the dignity it restored, however fleeting, was real. When the doors closed each night, the streets filled again with breath and froth, and the bathhouse boilers cooled, the soup pots emptied, the workhouse fires died down. But for a few hours each in the Empire's coldest heart heat had been shared, not freely, not kindly, but shared nonetheless. The Victorians prided themselves on invention, on conquering nature with progress and iron. Yet in the end, what most people needed was simple: a bit of warmth, a clean corner, and someone to hand them a bowl without judgment. That was the true public warmth, brief, imperfect, but human. Victorians later romanticised the hearth as the eternal symbol of home, the warm, glowing heart of family life. The truth was far messier. The fire that once smoked, coughed and singed their eyebrows became, in retrospect, a golden halo of nostalgia. They forgot the soot, the burns and the smell. Memory has better ventilation. By the dawn of the 20th century, Britain had traded its coal shovels for nostalgia. Industrial chimneys still blackened the sky, but in parlours and magazines, the hearth had transformed from a functional furnace into an emotional relic. Illustrations of cosy families gathered around flickering fires filled Christmas cards, advertisements and sentimental novels. It was the glow of home, a vision so sanitised you could eat off it, if you didn't mind the lingering taste of irony. In reality, most Victorians spent their lives trying to escape the smoke. Fireplaces had been daily chores, expensive, dangerous and occasionally explosive, but distance breeds tenderness, and nothing glows brighter than the past viewed through a clean filter. The hearth, once a sweaty battlefield of soot and splinters, now symbolised comfort, purity and stability. exactly the qualities the modern, electrified world seemed to be losing. Magazines like The Lady's Realm and The English Home filled their pages with odes to the dear domestic fire. Poets waxed lyrical about embers whispering of peace, apparently forgetting that actual embers whispered mostly of singed carpet. Advertisers caught on fast. Coal companies ran full-page ads showing radiant families by spotless grates, cheerfully ignoring the fact that their product had been the cause of half the nation's respiratory illnesses. The warmth of home became a brand, its marketing tagline written in flickering nostalgia. Painters joined in too. Artists like George Elgar Hicks and William Frith painted lowing domestic scenes, rosy children toasting bread, mothers in lamplight, fathers reading newspapers with angelic patience. You can almost smell the roast chestnuts. What you can't smell is the coal smoke, the chamber pot nearby, or the child coughing from soot inhalation. In art, the Victorian home had perfect air circulation and no servants, because those details made sentimentality less photogenic. The hearth's transformation wasn't just about longing, it was about identity. The Victorians, for all their pride in progress, secretly mourned what progress replaced. The old fire was a visible symbol of connection. People literally gathered around it. The new technologies of the 20th century, gas stoves, radiators, electricity, were efficient but impersonal. Heat no longer flickered, it hummed, it warmed without spectacle, and so the nation turned its gaze backward, to the age when warmth was a shared ritual rather than a silent function of plumbing. Even language shifted. Keeping the home fires burning entered the vocabulary during World War I, decades after most homes had stopped doing any such thing. The phrase caught because it meant more than literal fire. It meant love, perseverance, the idea of waiting warmth in a cold world. The hearth had become metaphorical, the emotional anchor of civilization. Somewhere between the last coal delivery and the first electric switch, the Victorians had turned smoke into sentiment. Meanwhile, architects embraced the Old English revival. Homes built in the early 1900s came with decorative fireplaces, some purely ornamental, never meant to be lit. These faux hearths, tiled and polished, were nostalgia cast in ceramic. You could practically hear the ghosts of past generations muttering, "You call that a fire?" Yet people adored them. They represented safety, the illusion that life was still centered around something glowing and dependable. Writers too leaned into the myth. Thomas Hardy, Elizabeth Gaskell, and countless minor novelists filled their pages with fireside scenes of confession, comfort, and moral revelation. The hearth became a stage where secrets were told, proposals made, and families forgiven. In these stories, no one ever burned the toast or coughed on the coal dust. The fire existed to symbolize redemption, not the smell of overboiled mutton. The irony, of course, is that while Victorian nostalgia turned the hearth into a temple of virtue, real homes were quietly discarding it. By the 1890s, gas lighting, hot water radiators, and electric heaters had begun to replace open fires in middle-class households. Architects celebrated smokeless rooms as symbols of modernity. But as the soot disappeared, so too did the drama of light and shadow, the flicker that made winter bearable. People missed the glow, even if they hadn't enjoyed the cough. And so the cultural memory of the hearth endured. It lived in postcards and poetry, in Dickens adaptations and Christmas rituals. Families gathered around newer forms of light, gas lamps, radios, televisions, yet called the experience fireside. Even when the heat came from hidden pipes, the metaphor remained. The Victorians had burned so much coal that they'd set their mythology in stone. Warmth equalled virtue, and the fire equalled home. In truth, the hearth's magic was never in its coal or flame, but in what it forced people to do: gather. The family circle was literal once, bodies drawn close by necessity, sharing breath and gossip and complaint. That proximity forged memories stronger than any ember. Even when the houses grew cleaner and quieter, the echo of that closeness lingered in every story told about the good old fire. And so, when later generations remembered the Victorian home, they didn't recall the frostbitten servants, the smoky wallpaper, or the ceaseless labour of keeping the fire alive. They remembered laughter in the glow, the illusion of peace, the shared warmth of survival. History, like smoke, softens with distance. The Victorians, who once cursed the cold and coughed on their progress, ended up immortalised by the very fire they fought to maintain. Their legacy glows still, not in coal dust or chimney soot, but in the stories we tell of comfort hard won and warmth remembered. In the end, the hearth became what it had always pretended to be, not a source of heat, but a symbol of hope, a small stubborn light in the long, cold story of winter.